Chapter 2703. Under this effect, the cracking sounds that appeared on the transportation paths that connected the small world completely disappeared. The small world that seemed to be on the verge of collapse stabilized and was once again connected to the transportation network layer. At this moment, the entire transportation network layer began to shake slightly. The countless worlds in the transportation network layer shone brightly at the same time, as though they were triggered by some strange power and began to resist fiercely. Cries of surprise entered Luo Fan's ears. They were the cries of surprise from the world founders. The world founders originally thought that they would be able to sleep easy and enjoy the comfort they had before Luo Fan appeared after connecting to the transportation network layer and the layer of the lost sky. But they didn't expect that waves would appear again in such a short period of time. Moreover, it seemed that the waves this time were even more magnificent than the previous ones, and even more difficult to resist. How could they not be panicked? At this moment, Luo Fan sensed that the passages that he was looking for had appeared out of thin air outside the many world. They were the passages that connected to the tribulation layer. The destructive power of the tribulation was connected to each other, and the destructive power that was born from the tribulation didn't just represent himself. Fundamentally speaking, the power was the vanguard of the tribulation layer and the guide of the tribulations within the tribulation layer. As long as it affected the area, it would be completely within the range of the tribulation layer. Because of the transportation network, these worlds were affected by the destructive power, and their existence would naturally be discovered by the tribulation layer. As a result, the tribulation layer would build a passage that led directly to this world and send the tribulations over through the passage. In the face of such changes, Luo Fan's expression was only rather solemn, but he didn't panic or lose his head because of it. The current situation could indeed be said to be incomparably terrible to him. But how bad could it be? Could it be worse than when he first stepped into the simulated chaos state? At that time, he directly faced the collective rejection and attacks of countless trillions of worlds. Compared to the current situation where he was merely being corroded by tribulation, it was more than 100 times more difficult. Back then, in that kind of situation, he was able to turn the impossible into the possible, turning the situation into the one where he controlled billions of worlds. Now that this situation was 100 times simpler, how could he not be able to do anything? Moreover, even if he really had no other choice and allowed the tribulation's power to destroy those worlds, he would only return to his original state of being isolated and helpless. He could afford such a loss. It was precisely because of this confidence that even though he was solemn at this moment, he didn't feel discouraged or hopeless. At this moment, he focused all of his senses on the passageways that appeared out of nowhere in the transportation network layer. Previously, he had been yearning for one of these passages but was unable to obtain it. Now that there were so many of them here, how could he not seize the opportunity? In the simulated state of chaos, or even the true state of chaos, what truly shackled living beings was not power. Instead, it was cognition. It was just like standing in this simulated state of chaos. When he first stepped here, why did he feel like he was blind and couldn't even observe his surroundings or perceive himself? Was it because he didn't have enough power? Was it because he didn't have enough supernatural power? That was entirely because he didn't materialize his cognition. After that, when he materialized the world view of laws and turned it into a world of laws, this simulated state of chaos, which was originally like a boundless black curtain, finally revealed a certain aspect of the truth and the endless world. Finally, he wasn't blind and had the opportunity to complete the various achievements that followed. During this process, could it be that his strength had increased by so many times? How many times did his strength increase? Obviously, the biggest change that happened to him during this process was that he used his own concepts and cognition to deal with this simulated state of chaos. In terms of pure strength, his strength had not changed in the slightest during the entire process. From this, it could be seen how important cognition was for the simulated state of chaos. The simulated state of chaos was all-encompassing. Naturally, it was impossible for it to only be limited to what Luo Fan was currently in contact with. It didn't only include these worlds, not only did it include the layers of the world and the transportation network layer that he had established. Behind these layers, there were still more, and possibly even infinite, simulated layers of chaos. The tribulation layers that had many pieces of evidence to prove their existence were one of them. The reason why he couldn't detect or sense these many simulated layers of chaos was obviously not because he needed to reach a certain level of power, master any supernatural power, or master any authority in order to explore these layers. The reason why he couldn't detect or sense these layers was because his cognition hadn't touched these layers. In other words, to his knowledge, these levels were incomprehensible. In other words, because he couldn't understand how these layers existed, how they interacted with other layers, and how they interacted with other worlds, he couldn't sense these layers with a flick of his finger. In this case, if he wanted to detect and sense these layers, he obviously needed to understand their existence. It was even more so for the tribulation layers. Before this, although Luo Fan had already recognized the existence of the tribulation layers, he didn't know how they existed, how they interacted with other worlds, and how they interacted with each other. In this case, he naturally couldn't sense the existence of the tribulation layers. If he wanted to change this, he needed to come into contact with the power of the tribulation layers time and time again, and he needed to see how the tribulation layers interacted with other worlds. Before this, it was naturally impossible. The power of the tribulation level would only connect with the tribulation level at the moment of its appearance or departure. If he wanted to know how the tribulation level worked on other worlds, and how to communicate with other worlds, he could only take advantage of these two opportunities. Obviously, even for him, these two opportunities were still too little. Needless to say, when the tribulation's power descended, when he was sure that a world was affected by the tribulation, this opportunity had already passed. Clearly, the only thing he could hope for was the time when the power of the tribulation would leave. Theoretically speaking, he had the opportunity to experience and study that opportunity. However, this opportunity would only appear after he had thought of a way to help a world resist the tribulation. Moreover, this required luck. He needed to have the qualifications to turn things around in that world before he discovered it, and he needed to be in control of the situation in that world. Only then would he be able to achieve this. If there was a problem with either of these two worlds, then he could only miss this opportunity. Therefore, although he had encountered the tribulation of two worlds before, in the end, he had only seen the power of the tribulation once and returned to the tribulation layers. In order to establish an idea and gain knowledge about the tribulation layers, just this one time was clearly far from enough. From this point of view, the current situation was really like a pillow for Luo Fan when he wanted to sleep. At this moment, there were countless worlds in the transportation network layer, and each of them was withstanding the corrosion of the tribulation's power. Around and even inside each world, there were passages leading to the tribulation layers. This was equivalent to giving him tens of thousands, or even hundreds of millions of opportunities to establish an understanding and an idea. At this moment, Luo Fan quickly discovered this good opportunity, but he did not miss it. Instead, he instantly got rid of all other distracting thoughts and focused all his energy on the countless passages that appeared out of thin air in front of him that led to the tribulation layers. Fortunately, he had the mental attainments to equate hundreds of trillions of years with an instant. Even if the countless passages appeared almost at the same time, he could arrange the order of observation in an orderly manner so that he would not miss a single passage. 1 passage, 2 passages, 3 passages, 100 passages, 200 passages, 300 passages, 10,000 passages, 20,000 passages, 30,000 passages, 100 million passages, 200 million passages, 300 million passages. As the number of passages increased, Luo Fan's guesses about the tribulation layers became less and less. In the beginning, he had guessed that the tribulation layers existed in hundreds of millions. In other words, in his mind, he had already established a model of the existence of the tribulation layers that was calculated in hundreds of millions. These models were all-encompassing, and there was a high possibility that they included the true model of the tribulation layers. It was just that this correct model was mixed among the countless wrong models, so Luo Fan could not turn it into a true understanding at all. As a result, although he had established such an accurate model, he still could not observe the true tribulation layers. In this way, what Luo Fan needed to do to observe the passages of the tribulation layers was very simple. That was, to eliminate the billions of models that were calculated one by one. After he eliminated all the impossible models, the model that was left in the end was naturally very likely to be the correct model. Of course, if he still could not discover the existence of the tribulation layers after turning this model into knowledge, he could only re-establish the model and do it again. Although this seemed to be impossible to obtain an absolutely correct answer, compared to being unable to find any traces or methods, it was already quite good to be able to establish such a rather feasible exploration mechanism. Because each passage was aimed at a different heaven and earth, its form would definitely be somewhat different. In this way, each passage could naturally contain a small part of the characteristics of the tribulation layers. This allowed Luo Fan to use these passages to eliminate the models successfully. After all, a correct model would naturally have to fit countless passages and contain even the smallest part of the characteristics of the tribulation layers contained in those passages. Although there were many models, each had different characteristics and tendencies. If it was not a correct model, it would definitely be impossible to fit such a large number of passages. Therefore, as the number of passages Luo Fan observed increased, the number of models that he eliminated also increased. In the end, when he had observed nearly 70% of the passages, which was also when he believed that more than 10,000 years had passed in his mind, there was finally only one model left in his mind. Of course, although 10,000 years had passed in his mind, compared to everything else in the transportation network layer, and even compared to the power of the tribulation layers, this period of time was not even a blink of an eye. After all, the passage of the tribulation layers would not exist for a long time. It could be said that if he did not have the ability to equate billions of years with an instant, he would definitely not have been able to complete this observation process. With this last model left, Luo Fan's observation speed of the many passages greatly increased. It had taken him tens of thousands of years of self-knowledge to completely observe 70% of the passageways. But now, for the remaining 30% of the passageways, he had only spent less than 10 days to complete the entire observation process. Of course, this was not because his observation ability had suddenly improved by so much. Instead, after confirming this model, he no longer needed to bring in tens of thousands of models to compare with each passageway to confirm whether the model was compatible or not. All that was left was a model, and all he needed to do was to substitute this model into it. This difference in the number of models made his observation efficiency increase by more than tens of thousands of times. The observation process of thousands of years was compressed into 10 days. This was actually the reason why he paid more attention to each passage than before and used more methods to compare them. Otherwise, the time would probably be reduced by several times. The final comparison result told him that the model he was left with was at least correct for the unknown number of passages in front of him. Chapter 2704. This shadow was so huge that compared to it, the originally vast and boundless transportation network seemed so insignificant. The shadow's main body was a strange existence that couldn't be described with words. It contained boundless baleful aura, boundless lightning, boundless destructive power, boundless flames, and poisonous mist. Everything that could be thought of related to tribulations could be found in it. It was even to the extent that if one looked over, one would be able to see countless strange worlds hidden within it, and they would rise and fall indeterminately amidst the endless existences related to tribulations. This was the tribulation layer. The complicated scene in front of him was obviously because although Luo Fan had learned about the various characteristics of the tribulation layer, his knowledge was scattered and couldn't be completely integrated into a complete framework. It was just a simple accumulation of various characteristics. It could be said that this scene was both the true appearance of the tribulation layer and not its true appearance. The difference was so subtle and mysterious that it was really difficult to describe with words. At this moment, numerous passageways extended out from the tribulation layer and directly penetrated into the transportation network layer, targeting most of the worlds in the transportation network layer. It was like countless tentacles reaching out and piercing into the worlds in the transportation network layer. All kinds of incredible power, and even heaven and earth were constantly pouring into the transportation network layer through those tentacles and flooding the many worlds. From the perspective of the heaven and earth, the tribulations were unleashing all sorts of power, all sorts of worlds, all sorts of space-time attacks on them, trying to destroy them. However, if one were to look at it from the perspective of the tribulation level, the situation would be different. For the tribulation layer, its goal at this time was to assimilate those worlds and pull them into its body through those tentacles. It could be said that it was just a process of eating, or rather, expanding. At this moment, a tentacle reached out from the tribulation layer and extended towards Luo Fan's world of laws. Luo Fan built the transportation network layer to transform the many worlds in the simulated state of chaos into power that he could control. But he didn't really want to completely bind himself to those worlds. Therefore, the transportation network layer seemed to be equal for all worlds, but in fact, there were different levels between the many worlds. Among them, the law world was the core of the core. It could be said that it was within the protection of many worlds. Therefore, even though the tribulation layer had completely seeped into the transportation network layer through Luo Fan, then through the world of laws, and finally through the layer of the world of laws that was the source of the tribulation layer, had not been attacked by the tribulation layer just now. There were many tentacles and passageways in the tribulation level, but none of them truly extended to his world of laws. Only at this moment, when the entire transportation network was destroyed by the tribulation level and everything was under the destruction of the tribulation level, did the passage to the realm of laws finally open. Only then did the tentacles truly extend to where his world of laws was located. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan didn't dare to be negligent. With a flash, he directly passed through the transportation network layer that was riddled with holes and returned to his world of laws. Although the world of laws didn't seem to be important to him anymore, he was no longer relying on the world of laws to perceive the simulated state of chaos and other worlds. Instead, he was directly relying on the transportation network layer and the tribulation layer. The world of laws didn't seem to be important anymore, and even its destruction didn't seem to have much effect on him. But in fact, this was just an illusion. The world of laws was still extremely important to him. Without the world of laws, his situation might be a little better than when he first stepped into the simulated state of chaos, but it was only a little better. Once he lost the world of laws, all the abilities he had obtained in the simulated state of chaos would gradually disappear. His sense of the tribulation level, his sense of the other heavens and earth, and everything else, would gradually disappear as the tribulation level eroded. There was no other reason than that the world of laws was the core of everything he had built in the simulated state of chaos. Once he lost this core, the world of laws and the transportation network layer would gradually collapse and eventually turn into nothingness. And if he lost these two, Luo Fan could only rely on his own perception to see the tribulation layer. Once he fell into such a situation, it would be equivalent to him being directly devoured by the tribulation layer, and his true body would directly enter the tribulation layer. It was just like the entire process of the worlds connecting to the world of laws and the transportation network layer. Could it be that those heavens and earth were connected to these two because their positions had really changed? That was only because they resonated with these two heavens and earth. Once Luo Fan completely lost all other means to observe this simulated state of primal chaos, he could only wholeheartedly rely on the tribulation level. In this case, what was the difference between resonating with the tribulation layer and being directly connected to the tribulation layer? And once he was connected to the tribulation layer, what awaited Luo Fan would be the attacks of the countless worlds in the transportation network layer directly concentrated on him. It went without saying that the situation would be much more dangerous than it was now. Clearly aware of this, Luo Fan knew that what he had to do now was to protect his world of laws and help it survive this tribulation. "Sir, where did you attract such a terrifying enemy?" At this moment, a voice came from many worlds and drowned out Luo Fan's world of laws like a surging wave. These were the angry voices of the world founders who had encountered the tribulation. One had to know that for these world founders, everything that had happened just now was unknown to what Luo Fan, who had forcibly pulled them into the transportation network layer, had done, but suddenly the entire transportation network layer had fallen into a boundless disaster. All kinds of unimaginable disasters fell on their world out of thin air, making them feel as if their world had suddenly been exposed to an incomparably terrifying existence, and they were suffering the wrath of that terrifying existence. How could they not be angry at such a feeling? How could they not want to seek justice from Luo Fan? This is the tribulation all of you will inevitably encounter. Can't you guys sense it? Luo Fan said indifferently. Although the tribulation layer had discovered these worlds because of Luo Fan, the truth was that the tribulation these worlds had encountered was not entirely caused by Luo Fan. In fact, these worlds existing in this simulated state of chaos would inevitably encounter such tribulations, and they would inevitably attract the attention of the tribulation layer. It was just like how a perfect world in a state of chaos would inevitably cause great tribulations of the world one after another until it was completely destroyed, or until it passed through 9 great tribulations and transformed into a great world. These worlds in this simulated state of chaos would also encounter simulated great tribulations of the world. He didn't know what form the great tribulations of the world in the state of chaos would take. However, the simulated great tribulations of the world in the state of chaos existed in the form of the tribulation layer. Therefore, it was inevitable that they would be discovered by the tribulation layer. As long as their world continued to grow, there would eventually be such a day. The only difference was the timing of the arrival of the simulated great tribulations of the world. If it weren't for Luo Fan's means, perhaps they would only be discovered by the tribulation layer after hundreds of millions of years. Only then would they truly have to bear the attacks of the tribulation layer. From this aspect, at this time, Luo Fan's actions only brought forward the tribulation that they would inevitably encounter. From this aspect alone, Luo Fan seemed to have let them down. However, from another aspect, they actually had to be grateful to him. After all, when these worlds grew to a certain size in the future, the tribulations that would be triggered by them would be completely different from the ones that were triggered earlier than they were now. In the future, they might need to use 20% of their full strength to survive that tribulation. Then, at this time, because the size of the world was relatively small, and because the tribulations weren't that much, they might only need 12% of their full strength to survive this tribulation. Of course, the world founders obviously weren't in the mood to weigh all of this at this time. To these world founders, they only knew that they were originally free of tribulations. However, because of Luo Fan's actions and because of his coercion, they encountered the greatest disaster ever since they entered this simulated chaotic state. Given this point of view, one could imagine how intense their anger and displeasure towards Luo Fan was. Sir, you're using us to block the calamity, yet you're still saying such sarcastic words. Even we can't stand it anymore, one of the world founders spoke up at this moment. As he spoke, voices of agreement erupted from the various heavens and earths. Luo Fan didn't know what was going on at first, but he quickly understood. The person who spoke was the world founder who had first contacted the other world founders. The world founders who echoed him were the other world founders that he had contacted. "Oh, are you guys still planning to carry out your plan?" Luo Fan asked indifferently. At this moment, although there was endless destructive power pouring into his world through the passage of the tribulation level, he didn't even need to control it. However, he didn't even need to do anything. The firewall and antivirus software that he had built, which had gained sentience, were already able to naturally control the power and might of the world to fight against the destructive power. Therefore, although he seemed to be in a precarious situation, he was actually as stable as Mount Tai. At least for the time being, he didn't need to resist the destructive power from the tribulation level. It was also because of this that he had the time to communicate with the world founders. The world founders were slightly stunned. They clearly didn't expect Luo Fan to have such a clear grasp of their actions and even know what kind of plan they were carrying out. At this moment, an inexplicable shadow rose in their hearts. The reason why a conspiracy was because it was a conspiracy that couldn't see the light of day. Once it saw the light of day, and was discovered by the target of the conspiracy, it would be difficult for the conspiracy to work. At this moment, Luo Fan discovered their plan. In that case, would it still have a chance of success? No, that plan can no longer succeed. Moreover, even if it can succeed, there's no need for it anymore. The world founder who first contacted the other world founders left the world he had created and said so. Even if there were countless worlds, even if countless worlds had fallen into the tribulation at this moment, and even if the entire transportation network was riddled with holes, at this moment, the world founder's world had already been completely enveloped by the power of the tribulation. Although the entire world could still withstand it, it was clearly only temporary. The deterioration of the world couldn't be stopped at all. The entire world was deteriorating and collapsing at every moment. It could be imagined that it wouldn't take long before the entire world couldn't be salvaged and would truly be assimilated and devoured by the tribulation level. Originally, we planned to replace you as the core of the transportation network and suppress you instead. However, from the looks of it now, this place has already turned into a swamp. There's no benefit in seizing this place anymore. Instead, it's just digging our own graves. Therefore, we will completely change our nature and cut off all ties with this swamp, the world founder said. Rather than saying that he was talking to Luo Fan, it was more accurate to say that he was talking to the other world founders that he had contacted before. Chapter 2705. These world founders had been working together under Luo Fan's nose for so long, so they had naturally studied many things and set up various countermeasures for all kinds of accidents. At this time, this kind of response to getting out of this so-called quagmire was also within their scope of response. Therefore, at this time, the many world founders were already clear about what they had to do next. As for their agreement with the proposal of the world founders, it was needless to say. Just as he said, the transportation network layer had already become a quagmire at this time, and there was no value in refining it at all. Under such circumstances, it was more appropriate for them to cut off contact with the transportation network layer as soon as possible and form their own system. Even if doing so would completely cut off their previous plan, they didn't care. According to their previous plan, they should have gathered the power of many worlds to form a single body, and then used this body that was tens of thousands of times stronger than the original world to crush Luo Fan's world of laws and snatch the authority of the world of laws in the transportation network layer. In that case, the transportation network layer would no longer be a means for Luofan to restrict them, but would instead become their best tool, allowing them to use the transportation network layer to get rid of Luofan. There were still many difficulties that had yet to be resolved in order to achieve such an outcome. But at least in theory, such an outcome was possible. In other words, if everything went smoothly for them, they would start to take action after a certain period of time, directly launching an attack on Luofan and the world of laws. They would take advantage of such an attack to seize the authority of the transportation network layer. But obviously, the development of things was beyond their imagination. Before they had solved all the difficulties, the transportation network layer had completely lost its original value, and instead became a restraint for them. How sharp was Luofan's thinking! At this time, he had already completely understood their previous thoughts and current thoughts. At this moment, a faint smile appeared on his face. "I see. It seems that you guys have really found a possibility to turn things around in the impossible." At this time, he also felt that it was a pity that the plans of these world founders had changed before they could be implemented. Of course, it was not because he had some special hobby or desire to suffer. It was because he wanted to know what they could come up with to resist his control over the entire transportation network layer and change his authority as the core of the transportation network layer. At the very least, he still had no idea how he could achieve this. If they could think of a way, then even if the transportation network layer was handed over to them, he felt that it was worth it. After all, this would greatly deepen his understanding of the nature of the transportation network layer, his own world of laws, and the nature of the simulated state of chaos. Compared to the deepening of his understanding, the value of the transportation network layer was nothing. He didn't mind handing it over to them. The world founders did not really explain their plan to Luofan. After receiving the feedback from the other world founders, they could not be bothered with Luofan anymore. They turned around and returned to their own world, starting to act according to the plan they had discussed. This was the critical juncture of the endless tribulations. Every minute and second delayed would cause the world to suffer more damage. Facing such a situation, if it was not for the fact that they had no choice but to come out and unify their thoughts, the world founders would not have wasted even a little time. At this moment, the world started to shake. As the world shook, phantoms gradually appeared on their bodies. The phantoms were so strange. They seemed illusory and solid at the same time. After they appeared, they naturally broke free from the endless power of the tribulations and began to transcend. In the place where their world was originally located, there was also another world. However, this world was like an empty shell, like a corpse. Under the endless power of the tribulations, it collapsed layer by layer and shattered. The speed at which it collapsed and shattered was at least 100 times faster than before. Luofan knew what was going on with a single glance. This method of substituting death was a very normal ability for all cultivators. It could even be said that it was so normal that it was ignored by all cultivators. However, this substitution death technique had been directly raised to the level of the world. In other words, what they were using now was a substitution death technique that was specially modified for the world. The essence of the substitution death technique was to leave an empty shell that had all the characteristics of the cultivator and let the empty shell withstand the attacks that the cultivator could not defend against. For a cultivator, doing this much was already enough. With this little gap, the cultivator would be able to escape who knows how many millions and millions of miles away. However, for the world, this was only the beginning. The true use of the substitution death technique was not to allow the world to escape from the tribulations, nor was it to prevent the world from being corroded by the tribulations. In reality, this method was just to give the world a chance to breathe. After all, for the tribulations, it was locking onto the essence of the world. As long as the essence of the world did not change, no matter where the world went, no matter how many times the tribulation was blocked or misled, it would still lock onto it after a period of time. If the methods of the world founders were only at this stage and thought that they had escaped by using the substitution death technique, then when the substitute of the world was destroyed, the tribulation would find them again in the next moment. Even if they seemed to have let their world transcend the transportation network layer, although it was the first time that the world founders had encountered this tribulation, they did not have a good understanding of it. However, they had an equally terrifying enemy before them, and that was Luo Fan. They were well aware of how powerful and terrifying Luo Fan was. Facing such a terrifying enemy, they naturally had to be fully prepared. The ability to lock onto one's essence was also within their expectations. Therefore, even though it was their first time encountering this tribulation, it was extremely suitable for them to execute the plan they had used to deal with Luo Fan. At this moment, the many worlds were connected together, and their essence began to intertwine. The wills of the world's founders surged with each other, and their own paths of cultivation began to change subtly with this mutual agitation. Due to these changes, the world that was originally only slightly separated from the transportation network layer began to leave the transportation network layer faster and faster, and a wider and wider gap gradually appeared between them and the transportation network layer. With these changes, the power of the tribulation that had originally locked onto them because of the transportation network layer gradually lost its target. It could only search for the existences of these worlds in a daze, constantly plundering the substitute they had left in the transportation network layer. "Wait for us!" At this moment, a roar sounded from the other worlds. It was the remaining world founders who had finally reacted and wanted to escape from this swamp with these worlds. "Sorry." At this moment, a faint sigh was heard. Then, the worlds completely disappeared without a trace. With their disappearance, the substitutes they had left in the transportation network layer lost all their mysteries. Under the power of the tribulation, they collapsed and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. Even if the purpose of the substitute death technique was to sever the connection between the substitute and the original body, it was still a technique, a method left behind by the worlds. Thus, it was impossible for them to have no connection with the worlds at all. In the end, their existence still required the support of a certain existence of the original body. Under such circumstances, once the original body completely severed its connection with the substitute would naturally be unable to support itself, let alone withstand external attacks. "No!" the many world founders exclaimed in unison. Distorting one's own understanding and adding so many worlds to one's worldview. Even if one can escape with this method, one will no longer be oneself in the future. Luo Fan's feelings were a little complicated at this moment. To be honest, the methods used by the world founders were quite brilliant. The worlds that the world founders opened were all based on their own worldview and their own understanding of the world. If such a world wanted to fuse with other worlds, it clearly required the world founders to change their own understanding so that they would completely acknowledge that their world was fused with other worlds. This was completely deceiving themselves. If it wasn't for the fact that the world founders were existences that could condense their own unique worldview, it would definitely be impossible for them to achieve this. But even so, it was very easy for them to distort, and the possibility of them recovering was very small. This was because, after being distorted, they had already regarded their distorted thoughts as correct, as the absolute truth. If they were to distort their own worldview, it would be equivalent to repeating the current distortion. If they were to strictly categorize themselves, that process would be equivalent to killing themselves again. Furthermore, even if they were to be killed again, they would no longer be the same as before. Instead, they would become people who had the same thoughts, the same understanding, and the same appearance as they were now. They were merely the creators of the world. This method could indeed allow them to escape, but in Luo Fan's opinion, it would only allow a world founder who looked exactly like them to escape. The moment they distorted themselves, they actually no longer existed. Seeing this method, how could Luo Fan, who wanted to see what extraordinary methods and creativity they had, not feel disappointed? They left first, let's do it ourselves. At this moment, a world founder shouted. His voice spread throughout the entire transportation network layer, causing it to fall silent. They were very clear about the current state of the world founders who had just transcended, and what principles they had used to transcend. After connecting to the transportation network layer, their understanding of the world, their understanding of the simulated state of chaos, their understanding of cultivation, and even their understanding of concepts had greatly improved compared to before. This improvement gave them enough foundation to understand that after those worlds transcended, they had at least formed another layer that simulated the state of chaos. In addition, there was another layer of simulated chaos that was similar to the heaven of laws. In this case, they naturally understood that if they wanted to escape from this calamity that affected the entire transportation network layer, they obviously had to make the same choice. For them, who had already changed their understanding several times, it was obviously not difficult to make such a choice. Although the change this time was more thorough than any of the previous times, it was also more irreversible. That's right. If they don't bring us along, we can do it ourselves. The world founders roared. At this time, there were even more vigilant gazes that turned towards Luo Fan's location from all directions. Don't worry, I won't stop you. You can do as you please. Luo Fan sensed their gazes and smiled faintly. These world founders wanted to court death, so he naturally couldn't be bothered to drag them back. With regards to Luo Fan's decision, the world founders were a little bewildered. But at this moment it was like an arrow on a bowstring, and they had no choice but to release it. If they transcended and formed their own body, they would still have a chance to escape. But if they didn't transcend, what awaited them would undoubtedly be death. Under the threat of death, even if there was a sea of fire in front of them, they had to wade through it. At this moment, the world founders completely ignored Luo Fan's strange behavior. At this moment, they communicated with each other telepathically and began to use the fastest speed to study how to cooperate, how to change, and how to unify their thoughts. Chapter 2706. At this moment, Luo Fan had already retracted his perception from the outside world and shifted it to his world of laws. At this moment, the tribulations encountered by this world of laws were much stronger than before. This made it much more difficult for the antivirus software and firewalls that he had built to resist it. Due to such changes, the antivirus software and firewalls absorbed some kind of subtle nutrients from the changes of the tribulations. Through such nutrients, they unknowingly obtained great growth. As they grew, the two of them had already turned into two long rivers that appeared in the void of this world of laws. It was as if two heavenly Daos had appeared in this world. The infinite power of the two permeated every aspect of this world of laws. All the tribulations that poured into this world were suffering from targeted attacks from the two of them. In other words, for the tribulations, it was as if the world was in the midst of the tribulations. The power of the tribulations that the world encountered differed from one world to another. Each type of tribulations was completely targeted at the situation of the world and manifested in the most uncomfortable way. At this moment, the tribulations that entered Luo Fan's world experienced the same thing. The resistance they encountered was also completely targeted at the power of the tribulations. In other words, it was what made the tribulations the most uncomfortable. In this way, the power of the tribulations was gradually being pushed back, and large swathes of them were being destroyed. If it wasn't for the fact that the tribulations were still eyeing him covetously and pouring the power of the tribulations into the world of laws, the power of the tribulations might have been completely destroyed by now, allowing his world of laws to survive this tribulation. But even so, the power of the tribulations couldn't really produce any real effect. At the very least, the outcome that they originally wanted to deal an unimaginable blow to this world and completely destroy it was obviously impossible to happen. Even something that could cause visible damage to this world didn't appear in this world of laws. To the many living beings in this world, what was happening now was just like what they had encountered a few generations ago when the world had just been formed. Boundless brilliance appeared out of thin air everywhere in the world. Of course, it was a few generations after all. Very few of these newborn creatures were able to recognize the difference between this light and the light from before. There was no way to truly discover that this brilliance was more than 100 times more intense and concentrated than before. Furthermore, he did not know that the various subtle principles contained within the light were more than 10 times more profound than those contained within the original light. To them, such a change in the world was nothing more than a retro. Some of the cultivators who knew of the legends even treated this as a great opportunity. They did everything they could to comprehend some of the mysteries within the light. As a result, the situation of the entire world became rather orderly. If it weren't for the incarnation of the tribulation, it shouldn't be a problem for me to survive this tribulation. I don't even need to do anything. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind as he watched this scene. If the changes of the tribulation stopped at this stage, then with the mysteriousness of the firewall and antivirus software that he had built, they would definitely be able to increase as the power of the tribulation increased. They would be able to maintain a state that was above the power of the tribulation and completely eliminate all the negative effects that the power of the tribulation might cause. However, it was obvious that this was not very likely. He did not forget how the countless passageways that connected to the layers of the tribulation appeared this time. They were constructed and guided by a creator of the world who was completely controlled and refined by the tribulation. At this moment, the incarnation of the tribulation was still connected to his transportation network layer and was still controlling everything behind the scenes. In this case, if things did not go smoothly for Luo Fan, he might not care about it. However, if things did not go well for the tribulation, Luo Fan did not think that he would sit idly by. At the very least, if Luo Fan was in his position, he would definitely not sit idly by and do nothing. For the time being, the situation in Luo Fan's world of laws had not developed to the point where the incarnation of the tribulation had to be dealt with. In contrast, what needed the incarnation of the tribulation to deal with was the various things that were happening outside the world of laws at this moment. At this moment, outside the world of laws, the many creators of the world had already unified their thoughts and determined what each of them would be responsible for and what they needed to be wary of in the following actions. After all, the many creators of the world were creators of the world of laws. As creators of the world, their wisdom, their knowledge of cultivation, and their understanding of cultivation techniques were not something that ordinary cultivators could compare to. In particular, the creators of the world that appeared in this simulated state of chaos were all creators of the world who walked the path of the reverse. This was obviously different from the real situation, but after all, it was the various changes that were derived from Luo Fan's seventh tribulation. Anything that went against common sense was obviously normal. Anyone who could walk the path of the reverse to this step clearly had extraordinary wisdom. With a precedent in front of them, a fixed goal in their hearts, and a lot of people who shared the same path and shared the same thoughts, it seemed like they could create almost any cultivation art, any technique, and any formation. What was happening in front of them was the integration of their ideas, distorting their understanding of the world, and changing the nature of their world. This was something that ordinary cultivators found unbelievable, but it was nothing to them. From the time they thought of it to now, it was enough for them to create a method and experiment thousands of times. Therefore, at this moment, the creators of the world began to display their means. Their wills began to connect, and their thoughts began to connect. All kinds of concepts, ideas, and understandings echoed in the hearts of the many creators of the world. As it echoed, a brand new world view that was completely different from the original understanding of all the creators of the world gradually appeared in everyone's hearts. With the appearance of this world view, the world of the creators of the world began to change slightly. At this moment, the world version of the substitution death technique was displayed by the many worlds that still remained in the transportation network. One after another, the illusory figures broke away from the original locations of those worlds, leaving behind shells in the original locations of those worlds. This situation was extremely similar to the methods used by those heavens and earth. It could even be said to be the same. Clearly, although the creators of the world were extremely intelligent, it was still not enough for them to completely get rid of their previous successful experiences and recreate worlds based on their experiences. In such a short period of time, all they could think of was to completely replicate the methods of the other party. However, if things went smoothly, this would be more than enough. "Let's go!" A furious roar sounded out, and the illusory figures fused together, turning into a world that was countless times larger than before. It rose up into the void, and in the blink of an eye, it seemed like it was about to completely break away from the transportation network. Sensing that their connection with the tribulations was becoming fainter and fainter, the creators of the world were extremely excited. "We've finally succeeded. This way we will no longer be affected by the so-called tribulations, and there will be no more tribulations or immeasurable tribulations." This was the thought that appeared in the minds of the many creators of the world. The previous creators of the world had transcended after the same change, and from then on, they were no longer affected by the tribulations, and completely disappeared from their senses. At this moment, a sneer suddenly rang out in the ears of all the creators of the world. "Have you all forgotten about my existence?" It was a woman's voice, a voice that Luo Fan was rather familiar with. Following this voice, the many creators of the world suddenly felt an indescribable feeling suddenly wrap around their hearts. In a daze, they felt as if they had been tied up by some indescribable rope, and their transcendence and sublimation seemed to have been completely severed at this moment. Soon after, they discovered that there was suddenly an additional figure in their world. It was a female figure that they had never seen before, but whose level was at least a level higher than theirs. It was the figure of the incarnation of the tribulations that Luo Fan had seen before, the one that had been refined by the layers of the tribulations. At this moment, the incarnation of the tribulations looked at the vast, boundless, and newly born world with a look of interest on her face. "A brand new world. Looks like my luck is pretty good." With these words, an unprecedentedly huge tunnel appeared out of thin air in this part of the world, and its landing point, its destination, was the place where she was standing at this moment. Endless power of the tribulations surged out of the huge passage, and began to pour down in a frenzy towards this world. The power of these tribulations was so great that it was greater than any of the passages that had been encountered in the previous worlds. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 times as great, but thousands or even tens of thousands of times as great. Under the effect of the power of the tribulations, a small world instantly appeared in this world. This was an absolutely pure world of tribulations. Everything in this world of tribulations was the power of the tribulations, and there were all sorts of characteristics and appearances of the tribulations. These various powers combined together in various unimaginable ways, forming an indescribably complete system. They mutually reinforced and complemented each other, causing all of the powers to seem to have suddenly come to life. They began to sublimate at every moment, exploding at every moment. As they sublimated and grew, the small world also rapidly expanded and began to frantically corrode the surrounding world, distorting and assimilating it until it became a part of the small world. In just a few breaths, the small world had expanded by tens of thousands of times, and it vaguely possessed the aura of a complete world. Of course, that was the world before it was built, and it wasn't a world that was built by the combined efforts of the world's founders. However, even if that was the case, that speed was already incomparably shocking. In fact, it was already incomparably terrifying. At this moment, the world's founders finally reacted, and they were all horrified. They began to frantically gather their power and suppress the small world from all directions. With the combined power of the world's founders, they did their best to limit the expansion speed of the small world. Naturally, they wanted to destroy the small world and completely erase the endless power of the tribulations in the small world. They wanted to completely cut off the passage to the tribulation layer. But clearly, there was a huge difference between what they wanted and the reality. Their power and methods were unable to affect the passage at all. The passage was like an illusory passage that didn't exist at all. No matter what methods they used, they couldn't touch it at all. Since they could not touch it, no matter what they did to the small world or how much damage they caused it, the small world would be able to easily replenish the power of the tribulations through the passage. As long as it was replenished with the power, no matter what kind of damage the small world suffered, no matter how close it was to destruction, it would be able to recover in an instant. In this way, the result was obvious. Although the world's founders did their best to suppress and resist the small world in an attempt to destroy it, they could only suppress the expansion speed of the small world in the end. Moreover, this suppression effect was getting weaker and weaker as time passed. Although the expansion speed of the small world was extremely limited in the beginning, and it was difficult for it to advance even a small step in a few days, as time passed and the effect of the suppression weakened, the expansion speed of the small world began to increase continuously, faster and faster. Chapter 2707. To the creators of the world, it was like a black hole had appeared in the world that they had built together. It was devouring everything that they had, and they couldn't resist or deal with it at all. It went without saying how desperate they felt. Although they didn't know what kind of existence the incarnation of the tribulation was, they knew that it was definitely closely related to the tribulation. An existence that was closely related to the tribulation and possessed the intelligence of a living being had appeared in their world at this moment. This made them wonder if their departure had brought away the source of the tribulation in the transportation network layer. If that was the case, then they would have gone for wool and come home shorn. One must know that the reason why they left the transportation network layer without any hesitation and wanted to form their own world was because the transportation network layer had become a quagmire and an abyss. In order to leave the quagmire and abyss, they even killed their original selves and betrayed the powerful Luo Fan. But now, the facts told them that their sacrifices might not be of any use. They might have paid such a huge price just to block the disaster for Luo Fan. This outcome naturally made them feel even more remorseful. At this moment, it had nothing to do with Luo Fan, no matter how regretful, furious, or struggling the other founders of the heavens and earth were. At this moment, he felt that the transportation network layer had fallen back into his control. The existence that had suppressed his control over the traffic network layer, causing the entire traffic network layer to be unable to be disconnected, closed, had disappeared without a trace. With a slight movement in his heart, he understood what had happened. The entire small world has disappeared. Looks like it's targeting the worlds that have left. A thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, the number of worlds in the transportation network layer had become sparse. There were originally tens of millions or even trillions of worlds, but there were only a few thousand left. It wasn't that the world founders had absolute confidence in Luo Fan, but that they had been completely assimilated by Luo Fan's world of laws. It was impossible for them to change their views and cognition, and they were no longer able to integrate with other worlds. Previously, the world founders were extremely anxious and regretful that they didn't join those worlds. They were powerless to change themselves and distort themselves to fit in with the worldview that the world founders had built together. But now, they were rejoicing over their powerlessness. They were rejoicing that they were able to stay in the transportation network layer. One must know that although they couldn't directly see what the world founders were going through after leaving the transportation network layer, and they couldn't see the absolute impact of the small worlds, they could still feel that after those worlds left. However, they could sense that the tribulations they encountered had weakened a lot after those worlds left. Vaguely, there was even a rebounding force acting on the tribulations, as if it was trying to push them away. In this situation, no matter how ignorant they were, they could tell that this was a sign of a turning point. Since there was a turning point, it meant that there was a great possibility that they could escape here and have a better future and a better way out. At this moment, the various powerful and terrifying impressions of Luo Fan that they had previously had resurfaced. As these impressions resurfaced, they unknowingly gained a lot more confidence in Luo Fan. Such a powerful existence might really be able to help us fight against the tribulations this time. Such thoughts flashed through their minds at this moment. With this thought in mind, the distance between them and Luo Fan's world of laws in the transportation network layer had unknowingly become much closer. The positions of the worlds in the simulated state of chaos did not depend on their true distribution in the simulated state of chaos, but on the relationship between the worlds and the degree of compatibility between different worlds. If the degree of compatibility was high enough, then even if the worlds were at the beginning and end of the simulated state of chaos, they would still be close to each other in the sensory perspective. However, if the degree of compatibility wasn't high enough, even if they were extremely close to each other in the simulated state of chaos, they would still be so far away that they couldn't be seen in the sensory perspective. Under such a background, these worlds seemed to be much closer to Luo Fan's world of laws, which clearly showed that their recognition of Luo Fan's world of laws and his world view of laws had unknowingly strengthened a lot. Of course, this kind of influence was naturally invisible, and it wasn't that Luo Fan had really taught them the world view of laws or taught them how to establish the world view of laws step by step. Their understanding of the world view of laws could only rely on the world view of laws, and they could only make guesses based on the bits and pieces of analysis of the world view of laws. At this moment, with such changes, the entire transportation network layer seemed to have shrunk a lot. It had originally seemed like a boundless ocean, but now it seemed like a small pond. "It seems that you guys have changed again," Luo Fan said faintly. His voice directly spread to the many worlds that remained in the shrinking transportation network layer and into the ears of the many world founders. For Luo Fan, he naturally wouldn't think too highly of himself to think that those world pioneers stayed in the transportation network layer because they firmly trusted him. However, he clearly grasped the mentality of those world founders and understood that they stayed because they couldn't escape. Their original intention, however, was absolutely to escape from the transportation network layer. But now, the distance between them and their world view of laws had suddenly shortened so much, and it was obvious that their thinking had changed again. Could it be that their cognition had once again distorted towards the world view of laws? It was precisely because he recognized this that he would say such words at this time. Hearing this, the world founders were a little embarrassed. Of course, it was just a little. After all, they had cultivated for such a long time and seen so many world founders, so how could they feel ashamed just because of such a sentence? "We no longer have a path of retreat. Please save us, sire," one of the world founders said. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "I have received your plea for help." He didn't give the world founders any face at all and directly expressed the true intentions of their actions. Facing this situation, the world founders didn't have any strange expressions at all. It was already past the time for them to risk their lives for the sake of face. At this moment, the situation of the many worlds and the tribulations in those worlds had already exhausted them. If it wasn't for the fact that the tribulations had suddenly weakened and some power had suddenly helped them resist the power of the tribulations, they might not even have the energy to talk to Luo Fan. At this time, even if they were insulted by Luo Fan, they would probably have to swallow their anger, not to mention that Luo Fan had just stabbed them. They were eagerly waiting for Luo Fan to say how he would help them get through the tribulations, but unexpectedly Luo Fan spoke again. However, I won't help you this time. Are you still holding a grudge against our choice just now? One of the world founders couldn't help but ask. Our choice before was very normal, right? If you were in our shoes, I'm sure you would have made the same choice as us. Besides, we didn't succeed, did we? Another world founder couldn't help but explain. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, I'm naturally not that petty. At least, your choices haven't crossed my bottom line for now. The reason why I'm saying this is because this tribulation isn't actually a disaster for all of you. It's an opportunity. His words caused the traffic network layer to fall silent. Opportunities and disasters were two sides of the same coin. The arrival of disaster usually represented a fortuitous opportunity. On the other hand, the arrival of opportunities also represented disasters. This was something that anyone who could cultivate to this level and reach the level of creating a new world in this simulated state of chaos was very clear about. The many world founders here were naturally aware of this as well. It was precisely because they were aware of this that they couldn't understand Luo Fan's words. Opportunities. They didn't find any opportunities in this abnormal tribulation at all. They only saw that in the tribulation, there were originally millions or even trillions of worlds in the transportation network, but now there were only a few thousand left. As for the remaining worlds, they might have already been completely destroyed by the tribulation. Where did Luo Fan see opportunities in such a terrifying tribulation? Haven't you ever wondered why your cultivation didn't increase at all after creating a world? Luo Fan asked. His words were like a clap of thunder that stunned the world founders. In their memories, they had already lived in the simulated primal chaos for countless trillions of years. In such a long period of time, apart from the time when they were confused and didn't know what situation they were in, and didn't know if they were still alive, ever since the world was created, their cultivation had been completely restricted. Until now, they hadn't improved much after billions of years. There was a world of difference between this and their previous cultivation. If it was in the past, before the world was created, they might have improved 1,000 times or even 100 times over such a long time. Now that they were exposed by Luo Fan's words, they all felt an indescribable complexity. There was anger, sorrow, astonishment, anticipation, and even more excitement in his eyes. Isn't this normal? One of the world founders said in confusion. If it was one or two, they might think that they had found the wrong cultivation method and didn't find the path to improve. However, if all cultivators and world founders were like this and couldn't improve much after creating a world, then even the most confident world founders would think that it was normal. Once a world was created, the path to improve would be severed. It was common sense, and at this time, listening to Luo Fan's words, it seemed that this was not a matter of course. They did not know how many billions of world creators had really not found the correct way to cultivate after so many trillions of years, and had not found the correct way to improve themselves. How could the world founders remain calm in such a situation? Of course it's not normal. There is no end to cultivation. Not to mention the fact that we don't have eternity and indestructibility. Even if we did, we would definitely be able to find a direction to cultivate and find a way to improve. The reason why you can't find a way to improve is because you haven't found a way and haven't found the right direction, Luo Fan said indifferently. His words were truly enlightening, and it caused indescribable excitement to surge in the hearts of all the founders of the world. So you're saying that the way to improve is related to the tribulations? One of the world founders said with a trembling voice. It's not just related. In fact, the tribulations are the way for you to improve. At least, from what I know, it's one of the ways, Luo Fan said plainly. The world founders were all stunned as if they were struck by lightning. However, their minds quickly started to work. All sorts of memories, knowledge, and scenes quickly surfaced from the depths of their hearts. They began to compare it with Luo Fan's words and analyze the possibilities in Luo Fan's word. As they dug deeper into their memories, they gradually realized that there was a great possibility that what Luo Fan said was true. This tribulation was most likely not a calamity for them, but rather an opportunity for them to improve themselves, to surpass their current limits, to surpass the shackles of their cultivation bases. It was a heavenly opportunity. Chapter 2708. The world founders all knew about the great tribulation of the world. In fact, in their own memories, the world that they were born into had also been attacked by the great tribulation of the world. The reason why they never thought that they would encounter a great tribulation of the world was because the great tribulation this time was extremely different from what they knew. It could even be said to be completely different. That was because their understanding of the great tribulation of the world was already fixed. Furthermore, they did not equate themselves with the world. They thought that the world was different from the real world and should not trigger the great tribulation of the world. They instinctively rejected this possibility. That was why when they encountered the great tribulation earlier, they did not think that it might be their great tribulation of the world. When they thought that it might be a great tribulation of the world, the doubts in their hearts were instantly answered. Furthermore, when they suddenly realized that the world that they opened up could trigger a great tribulation of the world, all sorts of complicated feelings surged from the bottom of their hearts. So I've already reached this step. This thought appeared in the minds of many founders out of nowhere. Splitting the heavens and splitting the earth was almost an instinct for cultivators. One must know that for cultivators, from the moment they were born, the world was the grandest, noblest, and most powerful existence that they knew. This was because all the powerhouses that they knew were born and grew up in the world. With such thoughts, they wanted to prove their strength and measure their strength. Usually, they would unknowingly head towards the result of splitting the world apart. Therefore, to cultivators, splitting open the sky and splitting open the earth was not just a method, it was also a form of emotion. It was also because of this feeling that ordinary cultivators would not be arrogant enough to think that the world that they opened up would be comparable to the real world. Even if cultivators had risen to the level of world founders, and could even create a world in the simulated state of chaos to protect and sublimate themselves, it was still the same. Although the world founders had lived in the simulated state of chaos for billions of years, and the time that they had split the world apart was the time that they had lived here. However, all this while, they had only treated the world that they had opened up as some sort of domain. However, none of them truly believed that the world they created could compare to the world they were born in. None of them believed that the world they created was the real world. But now, with the arrival of the great tribulation of the world, they suddenly understood that the world they had created was, at least in the eyes of the simulated primal chaos, the real world. This sudden affirmation caused them to feel as if they had just awoken from a dream. They recovered from the bewilderment and lack of confidence in the past, and all sorts of feelings that they hadn't felt in the past appeared out of thin air. For existences at their level, feelings and comprehension were not much different. To them, having such feelings meant that their bodies had changed, and that their bodies had improved. At that moment, all of them had this indescribable, complicated feeling. Their wills became firmer, and their knowledge became much more stable. Even the worlds they had created, which were struggling and tormented by the tribulations, began to resist and become much more stable. At the very least, he was a little further away from being completely destroyed by the tribulation. Facing this situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. He didn't expect the world founders to undergo such a huge change after hearing the news, and suddenly obtain such a great improvement. However, this outcome was a good thing for him, because it could save him a lot of effort. If it's a great tribulation of the world, then as long as we get through this tribulation, the world will naturally grow. The growth of the world will affect us instead. That way we can grow as well, one of the world founders mumbled. The other world founders all revealed expectant smiles at that moment. After being shackled for who knows how many trillions of years, they suddenly saw the hope of improving. It went without saying how excited they felt. It was already extremely rare for the world founders to not be overjoyed or dancing with joy. At that moment, all sorts of subtle changes appeared in the thousands of worlds. At this moment, the many heavens and earths were no longer repelling each other like before. After all, the reason why these worlds were still in the transportation network layer was because their connection with Luo Fan's world of laws was too close. The influence of the world of laws on them was too deep, and it was impossible to reverse or change it. Under such circumstances, perhaps they couldn't be considered as worlds of laws, but the commonality between them and the world of laws was already powerful to an extremely unimaginable level. This commonality was enough to erase the repelling caused by different natures. As a result, even though this place was still in a simulated state of primal chaos and these worlds were different, they were no longer repelling each other like before. Without the repelling effect naturally didn't exist anymore. There was no longer the incarnation of the tribulation in the transportation network layer. Although this simulated state of chaos was born because of Luo Fan, since it had deeply simulated the state of chaos, it naturally had to conform to the rules and the operating rules of the simulated state of chaos. In other words, after it was formed, it naturally equated Luo Fan with the other creators of the world, and would not look at him in a different light. It was the same for the power of the tribulation layer. Perhaps for the seventh tribulation this time, Luo Fan's existence was the focus of its attack. Even if it gave up everything, even if Luo Fan was alone, it would still focus its attack on him and completely ignore the other secondary targets. However, for this simulated state of chaos that had to conform to the operating rules, Luo Fan was just one of the most ordinary world founders. The world of laws that he created was also the most ordinary world among the endless world. Of course, perhaps because the simulated state of chaos was created specifically to deal with Luo Fan, it was created to attack him and make him destroy the various rules derived from it. Therefore, it was biased towards Luo Fan and his world of laws. If he didn't do anything, he would have to bear many more threats than the other world founders. However, that was ultimately just a bias hidden behind the scenes. As long as Luo Fan could grasp it and bypass it, he would naturally not be affected. As a result, there was only one result. That was, when the world founders left the transportation network layer, the incarnation of the tribulation did not choose to stay in the transportation network layer to deal with Luo Fan. Instead, it directly entered the huge world formed by the many worlds and attacked the tens of millions of world founders. After all, for the tribulation layer, there were only a few thousand world founders in the transportation network layer, or even less than 10,000. In the world that left the transportation network layer, the number of world founders was calculated in the tens of millions. With such a difference in numbers, if the incarnation of the tribulation remained there, then the normal operating mechanism mentioned before could be fed to the dogs. Tens of millions or thousands. If it didn't know how to choose, would the intelligence of the incarnation of the tribulation be of any use? Therefore, at this time, there was no existence of the incarnation of the tribulation in the transportation network layer. Without the incarnation of the tribulation, the power of the tribulation in the transportation network layer was obviously limited. Based on the level of the tribulation itself, whether the incarnation of the tribulation existed or not did not have much impact on the absolute power of the tribulation. However, whether the incarnation of the tribulation existed or not represented whether the incarnation of the tribulation had intelligence or not. If it had intelligence, the power of the tribulation would naturally be able to be focused and targeted at many targets. In that case, it would naturally be able to break the tribulation and erupt with power that was many times stronger than when it was evenly divided. If it didn't have intelligence, then the power of the tribulation could only be evenly distributed to many worlds. It didn't know what it meant to concentrate superior power, and it didn't know how to use complementary methods to target the target. As a result, the power of the original 100 could only be unleashed by 10 to 20% at most. Compared to the original situation when it had intelligence, the power of 100 could only be unleashed by 300%. The difference was too great. With such a difference, if the world founders still couldn't get through the tribulation, then Luo Fan could only ignore them and not think about borrowing their power. At this moment, he discovered that the world founders had reacted and knew the truth of the tribulation. After understanding the benefits that the tribulation might bring to them, he couldn't be bothered to pay attention to them anymore. Instead, he focused his attention on his world of laws. Although the world of laws wasn't under his control at this moment, the power of the tribulation was gradually being defeated, and it looked like it was about to be completely destroyed. Perhaps the heavenly Tao really exists. At this moment, he couldn't help feeling inexplicable emotions in his heart. The target of his emotions was naturally the antivirus software and firewall that controlled the power of the entire world of laws at this moment. At this moment, the two of them were in control of all the energy and laws in the world, and they were controlling them to resist the power of the tribulation that was coming from every direction. In this confrontation, his world of laws didn't suffer any damage at all. Instead, it continuously obliterated, absorbed, and assimilated the power of the tribulation. In the end, it turned into the power of the world of laws, allowing the world of laws to grow in the process. If I get through the tribulation, will it improve my worldview? At this moment, Luo Fan started to guess what changes would happen after he got through the tribulation. If it appeared in the true state of chaos, there would definitely be a huge improvement to the perfect world of laws once he got through the tribulation. It would be enough to allow the perfect world of laws to transform to a height that was unimaginable before the tribulation. In fact, it might even bring some kind of improvement to the perfect world of laws that was related to its essence. With such improvements, after 9 times, the perfect world of laws would finally absorb enough nutrients and grow into a great world. From then on, there would be no tribulations, and it would exist eternally in chaos. This simulated state of chaos. Perhaps it would be able to simulate such a profound state of chaos, right? To him, this world of laws was just a manifestation of his worldview. If this world of laws were to grow tremendously and undergo an unimaginable transformation, wouldn't that mean that his worldview would be able to grow tremendously? If I get through enough tribulations, will my worldview directly transform to a perfect level and become a true saint-level worldview after the 9th tribulation? He then thought. At the thought of this, he couldn't help but feel a little excited. If that was really the case, wouldn't that mean that he had directly embarked on the path to becoming a true sage? However, after thinking about it, he finally gave up on this ridiculous idea. No matter what, this was only the 7th tribulation. After this tribulation, he still had to get through the 8th tribulation and the 9th tribulation before he could become a true sage. This fact showed that no matter how perfect and incredible his 7th tribulation was, its upper limit was still fixed for him. No matter what, it was impossible for him to accumulate enough to become a true sage in this tribulation. It was impossible for him to become a true sage just like that. In this case, it also meant that the benefits brought to him after the tribulation were not as much as he had imagined, and it might not even have much of an effect on his worldview. Or, the tribulation in the simulated state of chaos was not like the tribulation in the true state of chaos, where there were so many of them. Chapter 2709. Both of these possibilities existed, and as for which possibility it was, it obviously depended on how the Great Tribulation chose. As he thought it through, the various thoughts in his mind gradually calmed down, and his mood regained its calmness. The Great Tribulation this time is settled. He looked at the world of laws and felt the advantages of the antivirus software and firewall in this world. He already had a judgment in his heart. At this moment, the situation in the world of laws was already self-explanatory. The firewall and antivirus software had been handled perfectly. Even if he was the one handling it, it would be difficult for him to do it as perfectly as the antivirus software and firewall at this moment. Of course, it wasn't because he wasn't strong enough, but because he didn't have such patience. He wouldn't add hundreds of steps to a task that could be completed in one step just to complete something unimportant, such as not affecting a certain aspect of living beings. Obviously, this was a matter of course for the antivirus software and firewall, and there was no need for them to choose. Therefore, at this moment, although the world of laws was experiencing the great tribulation of the world, there were only a few more streams of light in the entire world. Even the many living beings in this world didn't notice that the entire world was in danger. Perhaps in the next moment it would collapse completely. All living beings, along with the entire world, would be completely destroyed and disappear. Compared to Luo Fan's world of laws, the other worlds obviously didn't have such convenience. After realizing that this was their great tribulation and opportunity, the heavens and earth had gone from being powerless to being able to put up a decent resistance. However, the damage that the original world had suffered was still too great. At this time, even if they grasped the key, it was still impossible to turn the situation around in an instant. If that's the case, although the situation of the heavens and earth was improving, at least for the time being, the situation of the heavens and earth wasn't looking good. They were still extremely close to collapsing. If Luo Fan saw the heavens and earth collapsing in the next instant, he wouldn't be surprised. The flow of time between the heavens and earth was completely independent. Therefore, time was meaningless to many of the heavens and earth. For Luo Fan, it had only been a few hundred years since the tribulation had ended. At this time, he used the transportation network to sense the situation of the other heavens and realms, only to find that those heavens and realms were still suffering. Although the situation on that day had improved a little, it was not much better. If he continued to improve at this rate, he might not be able to fully recover even after tens of thousands of years. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's expression was rather calm. All of this was within his expectations. If that wasn't the case, he would be disappointed. His world of laws had such a huge advantage, yet it still couldn't be stronger than theirs. In that case, what qualifications did he have to appear here? As the last bit of the power of the tribulation was completely eliminated by the antivirus software and firewall, the world seemed to have completely shed its shackles and instantly became relaxed. Then, the tribulation layer that enveloped the entire transportation network suddenly surged. All sorts of indescribable existences began to pour into the world of laws through the passageway that had yet to be completely severed. Or rather, tentacles began to pour into the world of laws. These indescribable existences came in all shapes and sizes, and could be found in almost all the properties contained in the world of laws. After these indescribable existences sank into the world of laws, they didn't cause any damage to the world of laws. Instead, they turned into endless white light that intertwined with every aspect of the world of laws. They continued to seep into the world of laws and began to become one with it. This scene reminded Luo Fan of the heavens and realms that he had seen in the past when they had survived the great tribulation of the world of laws in the true state of chaos. Clearly, this was the reward for simulating the state of chaos after the world of laws had survived the great tribulation of the world of laws. So this is how the reward comes about. It seems like the tribulation I endured before will determine the reward I will receive in the future. Looking at the various existences that were constantly pouring out of the tribulation layer, Luo Fan had a deeper understanding in his heart. One must know that the reward that appeared in the tribulation layer at this moment for his world of laws was completely corresponding to the tribulation that had entered his world of laws before. In other words, it corresponded to all the responses that the world of laws had encountered in the tribulation layer. From this point of view, the antivirus software and firewall had gone the right way in dealing with the extremely complex response to this tribulation. Due to the complex cause and effect, the tribulation triggered quite a lot of reactions in the world of laws. The more reactions there were, the more types of rewards one would receive after the tribulation. In the end, it would spread to every aspect of the world of laws, and it would also allow the world to improve. In the blink of an eye, the world of laws began to grow continuously. It looked like a balloon that was constantly being blown up. Time, space, matter, energy, laws, the countless space-time on a deeper level, the potential of living beings, the species of living beings, and even the perfection of the world, as well as the complexity and profoundness of the great Tao. Everything was greatly improved in this process. Along with this improvement, Luo Fan's own world of laws also underwent a significant change. Vaguely, there seemed to be some indescribable existence that was constantly entering the world of laws through the connection between the world of laws and his world of laws. With the input of these various existences, his world of laws seemed to have been cleansed again and again, becoming more and more transparent and smooth. The original messy places were constantly sorted out, and the original seemingly right ideas were either denied or affirmed, and began to be constantly confirmed. It's not an improvement. Sensing this scene, Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief, but he was also a little disappointed. It was needless to say that he was disappointed. It was not an improvement, but it meant that the great tribulations that the world of laws might encounter in the future were not enough to allow his world of laws to overcome the obstacles and finally reach a height that he dared not imagine. This kind of restriction obviously made it impossible for him to take shortcut. Even if it was Luo Fan, it was impossible for him not to feel disappointed. As for the reason why he was relieved, it was because he was actually quite clear that if his world of laws really strengthened as he survived the tribulations, then his world of laws would probably no longer be pure. The world of laws was an absolutely independent and private existence. Different living beings would definitely have different worldviews. Even the perfect worldview of a true sage, which was enough to open up a perfect world in the state of chaos and make it eternal in the state of chaos, was only meaningful to a true sage. Such a perfect worldview wouldn't be able to play the same role for any other living being. It would just be an ordinary worldview that could only be used as a reference. Even the perfect level worldview of a true sage was like this, let alone the worldview of other living beings. It could be said that any worldview was only meaningful to the existence that sorted it out. Such a private, independent worldview and purity were almost the most important. No matter what kind of existence, even if it was heaven and earth, it couldn't affect or strengthen one's worldview without paying a price. Therefore, if the Great Tribulation could really directly strengthen one's worldview, then there would definitely be some problems with the strengthened worldview. Perhaps it would directly cause one's worldview to become completely ineffective, causing it to lose the possibility of further growth. Just thinking about this kind of thing was already terrifying. In fact, this kind of understanding had always existed in the bottom of Luo Fan's heart. It was just that such a fact was really hard to accept. Even Luo Fan wasn't too willing to accept such a fact. Therefore, when he was thinking about it previously, he instinctively shielded himself from this possibility. Instead, he was somewhat looking forward to this kind of tribulation directly strengthening his worldview. After all, if he really had to explain it, it was actually possible to explain it. After all, the real tribulation came from the state of chaos, and the state of chaos was a completely unfamiliar and incomprehensible existence to him now. No matter what kind of profundities, unimaginable powers, or unimaginable methods were not worth being surprised by. Therefore, within the scope of his understanding, the worldview of laws couldn't be directly strengthened by any external force, not even by heaven and earth, not even by the state of chaos. However, what if there were other parts of the state of chaos that he didn't understand that could violate this principle, and there were means to strengthen the worldview of laws without any side effects? For example, just like what you encountered on the road of becoming a Tao master, the land of opportunity left by the true saint, you can directly create an environment that strengthens his worldview in an indirect way, so that he can comprehend it on his own. All kinds of thoughts, ideas, or in other words, all kinds of wishful thinking were the reasons why he convinced himself. At this time, the reaction of the simulated state of chaos made his wishful thinking completely disappear. The simulated state of chaos was a simulation of the state of chaos, and it could even completely simulate all kinds of perceptual characteristics and cognitive characteristics in the state of chaos. There shouldn't be too much deviation in the simulation of this tribulation. If the real state of chaos could directly strengthen the worldview of living beings, even if the simulated state of chaos couldn't directly enhance the worldview of living beings like the real state of chaos, it would definitely have some corresponding effect. But it definitely wouldn't be like this, where there was no other reaction at all. All kinds of thoughts flashed in his mind, and soon, Luo Fan didn't have any mood to pay attention to these. At this time, he refocused his attention on the worldview of laws, and experienced the corresponding changes in his worldview caused by the various changes in the world of laws. This worldview didn't improve in essence because of this change, but because of the corresponding sorting out and the confirmation of various doubts. It also made his worldview indirectly improve unknowingly. At the very least, after this change, his worldview was much smoother and more perfect than before. If he were to really directly confront it with his worldview, the reorganized worldview would definitely be able to easily surpass the previous worldview. These various improvements didn't last long. In just a few days, all the changes had completely calmed down. Luo Fan's world of laws had increased several times after this change. The stability of the space, the stability of time, the innate vitality that filled the world, and even the potential of the living beings in it, as well as everything else, had made great progress compared to before. It felt as though this world of laws was completely different from the one before. In contrast, it seemed like the world of laws that Luo Fan had re-established after advancing a few realms. At this time, the firewall and antivirus software, which were used to resist the tribulation of the world, also received huge benefit. At this moment, the two had fused together, and they were in a state between being one and independent. This state was quite strange, allowing the two to separate and fuse at any time. After separating, the two were two individuals, but after fusing, they became a brand new individual. This structure was quite mysterious, and it coincided with a certain concept in Luo Fan's worldview. After such a change, the two had completely integrated into the world, becoming an inseparable part of it. They had become the heavenly Tao that truly existed in this world of laws. It was above all living beings, but it couldn't be compared to the Great Tao. Its authority wasn't much different from the Great Tao, and it vaguely existed as the will of the world. It was a mysterious existence. After the heavenly Tao took shape, the entire world seemed to have become more stable, and its defensive ability against all external forces had been further improved. Chapter 27:10. Originally, it was extremely difficult for the living beings in the world to comprehend the Grand Tao, laws, and improve themselves. After all, along with Luo Fan's improvement, the laws of heaven and earth had become more and more complicated and perfect. The Grand Tao and laws became more and more obscure. But at this moment, after the world survived the tribulation and received a great boost, the situation had changed. At this moment, the antivirus software and firewall had combined to form the Heaven Tao of the world, and it had started to reflect the Grand Tao of the world, the laws, and everything else. Under such circumstances, it was naturally easier for living beings to comprehend the Heaven Tao. Moreover, because the Heaven Tao directly involved all aspects of the operation of the world, and it was contained in natural phenomena such as wind and rain, it was countless times easier to come into contact with the Heaven Tao than the laws and Grand Tao. In this way, it made it easier for living beings to comprehend the profundities of cultivation contained in the world through the Heaven Tao. With such convenience, the speed of improvement of the living beings in the world would be greatly accelerated from this moment onward. Such an outcome was obviously a good thing for Luo Fan. The number of cultivators in the world had a huge impact on the world. Of course, such an impact was not necessarily a good thing. For example, if all the cultivators below the innate golden immortal realm had to seize the resources of the world to cultivate, then the more such cultivators there were, the more damage they would cause to the world. Perhaps at a certain stage the entire world might be completely destroyed because of such cultivators. In fact, that was how the legendary End of Days was born in many worlds. However, if the situation changed slightly, then it would obviously be completely different. Once cultivators above the innate golden immortal realm started to appear, then the more cultivators there were, the more benefits it would bring to the world. The reason was extremely simple. It was because cultivators at the congenital golden immortal realm and above were already capable of creating everything they required for their own cultivation. During the process of their cultivation, such cultivators didn't have to obtain anything they required from the outside world at all. Such a self-sufficient ability was sufficient for their existence to not cause any pressure to the world. Instead, it was the energy that leaked out during cultivation and released during battles that brought all sorts of replenishment to the world, allowing the world to grow. In this way, the more such cultivators there were, the better it would be for the world. This sort of special trait of a golden immortal realm cultivator seemed to be unbelievable, yet its appearance was actually a matter of course. The law of conservation of energy, which was worshipped by mortals as a truth, was meaningless to cultivation. At the very least, at the level of cultivators, this theory was not valid. This seemed to completely violate the understanding of living beings and the truth of the world. However, it was obvious that anyone who knew how the world was born would know that this was almost inevitable. Every world was created by a powerful being. The perfect heaven and earth was created by a true saint. The great heaven and earth was evolved from the perfect heaven and earth. At the end of the day, they were all done by powerful existences. Clearly, as powerhouses, they wouldn't split open the sky and earth just to watch the show. Even for true sages, the perfect heaven and earth, the great heaven and earth, they also had various meanings to them. Although Luo Fan did not know what the true meaning of its existence was, it was inevitable that it still existed. If it was meaningless, there wouldn't be so many perfect heaven and earth in the current state of chaos. As for Luo Fan, it was impossible for him to be born. Since such a world was meaningful to them, they couldn't let it go to destruction and extinction. After all, if a world was destined to be destroyed and perished, then even if the time of destruction and perishing was calculated in trillions of years, to those existences who could split the world apart in the state of chaos, it was the same as creating it today and destroying it tomorrow. No matter what meaning the world had to them, such a world could not last for long. Therefore, in order for the world to last for a long time, and for the world to help them achieve their goals, in that case, it was impossible for these worlds to have a trend of development towards destruction. In this way, when a cultivator cultivated to a certain stage, he would be able to help the world grow and sublimate it. If there was no such development and such a trend, as the number of living beings increased and the cultivation of life, the world would eventually run out of resources and completely disappear one day. In particular, it was even more so when the state of chaos was not a paradise. Of course, if the creator of the world was willing to give the world the ability to evolve endlessly and endlessly devour the chaotic state of the outside world to grow continuously, then needless to say, Even if the living beings tried their best to create and destroy, it wouldn't affect the world at all. Of course, Luo Fan had also thought about this. In fact, he even thought that with the ability of a true sage, it wouldn't be difficult to complete this design. However, obviously, not many true sages would make such a choice. In fact, there might not even be any true sages who made such a choice. The reason was very simple. Even if he didn't have a real intuitive understanding of the state of chaos, Luo Fan clearly knew that there were hidden rules that even true sages had to abide by in the state of chaos. This kind of rule was naturally completely different from the rules in the world. It must be a kind of rule that ran through the entire state of chaos, all the world, and all the living beings in it. Otherwise, there would not have been the great tribulation of heaven and earth, and there would not have been the entire process of the promotion from a perfect world to a great world. In fact, if there were no such rules, then there would probably not be so many colorful worlds in the state of chaos. Since there was such a rule, then it was impossible for a true sage to create everything he wanted at will, and it was impossible to completely not restrict the transformation of the true sage to the world. Perhaps it wasn't difficult for a true sage to set up such an ability to devour and sublimate infinitely. However, if they set it up, it would inevitably cause a reaction from the rules in the state of chaos. This reaction might be directed at the world or at the true sage. No matter what, there would definitely be a corresponding response. Among them, the time interval between the great tribulation of heaven and earth might be one of the manifestations of this reaction. In this case, directly setting up the world to have such an ability to sublimate and have such an ability to devour infinitely was obviously a setting that was definitely not cost-effective. In contrast, directly setting up the living beings in the world to be able to create their own energy and resources at a certain stage was obviously many times better than directly setting up the world. After all, if such a setting was given to the cultivators, then the consequences would be completely borne by the cultivators. In the end, perhaps the cultivators would trigger that kind of rule, or perhaps the cultivators would pay the price at a certain stage, at a certain moment, and so on and so forth. However, the final result would definitely be borne by the cultivators themselves. However, in contrast to this price, the benefits would still be absorbed by the world in the end, even though they had taken a detour. Obviously, cultivators needed to rely on the world for their cultivation. Since they needed to rely on the world, then all the power they cultivated would naturally need to be circulated in the outside world. Perhaps it was the release of power in battle, perhaps it was the release of power in cultivation, or perhaps it was the release of power in death. Everything would eventually return to the world, or in other words, be given to the world. Of course, this was not much different from letting the world absorb the benefits directly. The world would obtain the benefits, but the cultivators would have to bear the consequences themselves. There was no need to say which was better between such a design and letting the world bear the price directly. Therefore, as an additional product of the world, it was obvious that the cultivators would obtain the ability to be self-sufficient when they cultivated to a certain stage. Occasionally, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he was extremely impressed by the existence that created such a system of cultivation. Such an existence was worthy of the wisdom of a true sage. With just a small change, the entire state of chaos became full of vitality and gave the living beings in the state of chaos endless hope. This method of lifting heavy things as if they were light was really shocking. As for why it was said that the ability to be self-sufficient gave the cultivators endless hope, there was actually no need to say more. Although doing so might cause the state of chaos to add a certain price to the cultivators, compared to the benefits, this price could be completely ignored. Even if the price was to completely disappear in the end, making it impossible for the cultivators to continue to grow and progress at a certain stage, this essence could not be changed. This sounded a little awkward and unimaginable, but in fact, it could not be more natural. One must know that living beings were originally an additional product of the world. They were born from the world and were only a part of the cycle of the world. Under normal circumstances, such existences would not be able to resist any changes in the world. They would be extremely weak in front of the world, and once there were any changes in the world, they would definitely be the first to suffer. This was already destined from the moment they were born as an additional product of the world and were a part of the cycle of the world. However, if there was a cultivation method that could allow living beings to be self-sufficient, the situation would obviously be different. Once there was such a cultivation method that could allow living beings to be self-sufficient, in that case, living beings would have the hope of breaking free from the shackles of the world. They would have the hope of standing on the same level as the world and talking to it as equals. Once living beings reached the level of self-sufficiency, their relationship with the world would no longer be completely dependent on it. Instead, it would become a cooperative relationship. This kind of cooperation, even if it was a cooperation between the weak and the strong, was a cooperation between the weak and the strong. However, cooperation was cooperation. It was completely different from complete dependence. If it was complete dependence, just like what was mentioned above, all changes in the world would be the first to suffer. However, if it was cooperation, even if there was a huge difference in strength, it would allow the world to break free from the original cycle. The disaster would bypass the cultivator first, and it would only be its turn after all the others suffered. It could be said that the disaster would be pushed back. And after this self-sufficiency continued to improve, living beings would eventually obtain a status equal to the heavens and earth. Finally, living beings would be able to transcend and exist apart from the heavens and earth. Once they reached this step, any changes in the world would have nothing to do with the cultivator. However, such an outcome gave the living beings an extremely bright future, a bright future that could completely ignore everything and deny all disasters. Compared to such a future, any price was obviously worth it. In this chaotic state there would definitely be the original world. The original world might have been born naturally, or it might have been created by some external force. It might have been weak or powerful. However, as the original world, all living beings in this chaotic state must have come from it. The first true divine, the first cultivation method, the first world created by the first true divine. Everything must have originated from this primordial world. After the first true divine appeared, the second world could be born. And after this second world was born, there would be living beings of the second world, cultivators of the second world, and everything else. After that, there would be the third, fourth, and countless world. Just like that, it was passed down layer by layer until now. In the chaotic state, there were endless worlds, endless true sages, and endless cultivation methods. Therefore, in the end, the source of all true sages was obviously the first world. Before a true divine became a true divine, he must have been born in a world and cultivated in a world. As for those who were born in this world and cultivated in this world, they would naturally be affected by the true sage who created this world. They would have to follow the rules set by the true sage and cultivate according to the cultivation method arranged by the true sage. Before becoming a true divine, this true divine was in a different world. In this way, one true divine after another pushed forward. In the end, they would definitely be pushed to the first world. Chapter 27:11. Although Luo Fan had transmigrated before, even the Earth universe that he had been born in before he transmigrated was also part of this chain. Therefore, the world of laws that he had created and the world of laws that he had sorted out naturally included the mysteries of cultivation. It was also believed that after a cultivator reached a certain stage, they would break free from the shackles of the environment and become self-sufficient. In this way, the cultivators in the world of laws in front of him had become stronger, and the number of living beings had increased. This was obviously a great thing for the world. The stronger the cultivators, the more living beings, and the more cultivators that could cultivate to the level of self-sufficiency would naturally increase. With the increase of such cultivators, the various resources that leaked out in the process of cultivation and the various powers that erupted from them in battle would naturally increase as well. After these gathered into the world, they would become resources for the world to further grow. Perhaps the time when the great tribulation of the world descended was affected by this. The great tribulation of the world was obviously affected by various complicated and mysterious factors. Among them, the growth rate of the world was obviously one of the factors, even if it was not the only factor. Perhaps it's time to try preaching in the world. Feeling the changes in the entire world, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With that thought, he probed outside the world with his perception. In an instant, he understood the situation of the entire world in the transportation network layer. Apart from the world of laws, the other worlds were still struggling with difficulty in the tribulation. At a glance, light and shadow flickered, and even the shape of the world itself was distorting, recovering, breaking, and reconnecting from time to time. In fact, some of the worlds even showed signs of being unable to bear it, as if they were about to collapse. A tribulation was, after all, a tribulation. It was impossible for there to be no danger, let alone for everyone to survive it. Although thousands of worlds were only 1/10,000th of the original tens of millions of worlds in the transportation network, it was still an insignificant number. However, in terms of absolute numbers, thousands of worlds were no longer considered rare. With so many worlds, it was clearly unrealistic for every single one of them to easily survive the tribulations. After taking a look at these worlds, Luo Fan no longer paid attention to them. He turned around and descended into the world of laws. As if he had turned into an ordinary cultivator, he began to walk around the world. Although this world had improved greatly compared to before, and the cultivators here had made great progress compared to before, it was still the same as before. However, in the end, it was still an upgrade on a rather ordinary foundation. After the upgrade, the cultivation level of this world was still at the sage-to-be level. Compared to Luo Fan's own realm, this level was really insignificant. Even if it was an existence that had barely broken through to quasi-saint, it was still no stronger than an ant to him. In such a place, Luo Fan, who had the intention to pass on his Tao, did not even need to clearly express his attitude. He only needed to slightly leak his aura, and there would already be an unknown number of experts pestering him, planning to take him as their master. In this way, the work of preaching was naturally carried out very smoothly. However, in the short span of 100 years, Luo Fan had already spread all the cultivation principles and mysteries he wanted to impart to this world. The efficiency was tens of thousands of times higher than what he had done in the past. Because of his preaching, he had unknowingly gained a title in this world, a title that was respected by all the cultivators in the world. Tao Master. From a certain point of view, his title was really worthy of it. As the pioneer of this world, as the creator of the heavenly Tao of this world, as the source of all cultivation and all life in this world, he was indeed the Lord of the heavenly Tao, the Lord of the great Tao. As Luo Fan spent 100 years spreading all kinds of cultivation principles, the cultivation level of this world had unknowingly risen. In the past, the sage-to-be was already close to the end of cultivation in the eyes of the cultivators in this world. In their eyes, the realm above the sage-to-be should be the supreme, eternal, and indestructible saint realm. It was just like how Luo Fan thought when he first learned about the existence of experts like the saint realm. After receiving all kinds of cultivation knowledge from Luo Fan, they suddenly understood that the sage-to-be was nothing more than cultivation. Above the sage-to-be, there was still the false saint, the despairing, the supreme emperor, and even the experts who had entered the tribulation realm. Only after that was the true saint realm, a supreme realm that was eternal, indestructible, and indestructible. Understanding this, the atmosphere of cultivation in the entire world instantly changed. A sense of steadiness gradually permeated the world of cultivation in this part of the world. As this sense of steadiness appeared, the level of the cultivation world in this world began to rise continuously in a leaping manner. One must know that cultivation was closely related to one's mentality. Before this, those who felt that the sage-to-be was already close to the peak and only needed one more step to reach eternity would naturally feel a sense of complacency. As soon as this sense of complacency appeared, it was impossible for them to do their best to explore the truth of the world and the truth of cultivation. Without this kind of dedication, it would be almost impossible for them to improve. Yet now, after this complacency was completely shattered by Luo Fan, they'd once again recovered the cautiousness they had when they'd first stepped into the Tao, the novelty of everything, and the reverence they felt towards everything. So when they cultivated, 120% of their potential would naturally be stimulated, and the effects of their cultivation could naturally be expected. As the atmosphere changed, experts began to appear like a geyser in the next period of time. When Luo Fan felt that the cultivation of this world was already on the right track and that even if he did not intervene, it would be impossible to go back to the beginning, there was already a sage-to-be who brazenly broke through the limit and became a false saint, entering the first stage of the false saint realm. This also completely proved that the cultivation path taught by the Tao Master had finally completely dispelled the doubts that existed in this world about the path taught by Luo Fan. At this time, it had been 1,000 years since Luo Fan stepped into this world to preach the Tao. In just a short 1,000 years, he had already entered the false saint realm from the sage-to-be. This speed of progress was countless times faster than Luo Fan back then. This seemed extremely unbelievable, but in fact it could not be more normal. It should be known that when Luo Fan first cultivated, he did not have anyone to guide him. He explored and explored on his own bit by bit. But now, in this world, those cultivators had Luo Fan to guide them. He pointed them in the right direction from a strategically advantageous position, allowing them to bypass the forks in the road and advance along the brightest path. In addition, that cultivator was extremely compatible with Luo Fan's path of cultivation and his worldview. Just breathing here allowed one to obtain endless mysteries out of thin air, and the infusion of infinite principles. With so many conveniences, it was not surprising at all that he had achieved a breakthrough in 1,000 years. On the contrary, it could be said that he cared a lot about his foundation and tried his best to slow down his cultivation speed by using 1,000 years to achieve a breakthrough. On this day, the false saint realm came to see Luo Fan. Although this false saint realm was already standing at the peak of the world, he did not look dignified at all. On the contrary, he looked like a 7- or 8-year-old child with pink and jade-like makeup, looking rather cute. He came to the Tao Palace specially built for Luo Fan and bowed respectfully. After that, he said, reporting to Path Master, according to Path Master's instructions, we have found the signs of the next tribulation. Signs. Luo Fan, who was in the Tao Palace, was stunned. Back then, he had casually ordered all living beings in this world to pay attention to the signs of the next tribulation that might appear in this world. In fact, it was not because he wanted them to find such signs, but because he wanted them to know that this world was not stable and that incredible tribulations could descend at any time. After all, no matter what, this world was created by him. Obviously, nothing in this world could escape his senses. If there were signs of a tribulation, no matter what, he would be the first to sense it. It was impossible for those cultivators to sense it before them. However, he did not expect that now, before he could sense anything, they had actually come to report that they had found such signs. Slightly surprised, he spread out his perception, and everything in this world was included in his perception. This was not just everything in space, but also everything in time, and everything in karma. In other words, when he swept his senses, he did not just include everything that was happening and appearing in every inch of space in this world. Instead, his senses covered space and went deep into karma. He included the past, present, future, and many things that were connected by karma into his senses. If he simply included everything in this world in space, the information he would be able to obtain would probably be less than 1/10,000th of the information hidden in this world. Only by taking space, karma, and everything else into consideration would he be able to obtain as much information as possible. As he sensed it, he instantly knew what the sign that the pseudo-sage cultivator was talking about was. He could not help but feel slightly solemn. It's directly born from the bottom of the living being's heart. The tribulation this time was actually born in this way. In his eyes, the light and shadows of dozens of living beings appeared. These dozens of living beings were originally extremely ordinary living beings in this world. However, now all of these living beings had undergone some sort of mutation that was completely impossible to appear in this world, let alone naturally evolve. If one were to look at it in terms of form, this kind of abnormality would manifest itself differently in every living being. The final results of the mutation were also different. Some grew extra limbs, some underwent indescribable mutations in certain limbs, some grew extra organs in their minds, and some underwent some sort of strange change in their thoughts. There were many types of mutations. However, no matter what kind of changes, no matter what direction the changes took, the root cause was the same. That was the strange power that appeared out of nowhere from the deepest parts of their bodies. The power of a tribulation. It was the power of this tribulation that caused these living beings to undergo such a huge change. After this change, the actions of these living beings were all different. Some started to improve themselves, some started to assimilate other living beings, some started to control other living beings, some started to create some sort of destruction, and some directly created something that didn't exist in this world. All of this was like the horns of an antelope, completely untraceable. If it was an ordinary cultivator, there was no way they would be able to link all of this together. They would not be able to treat all of these changes as the same thing. However, Luo Fan was clearly not an ordinary cultivator. He could tell at a glance that the actions of these living beings would completely converge after a few thousand years. They would form an overwhelming wave that would completely drown this world. The sign that the fake divine sage mentioned was only the action of one of the living beings that was doing some sort of destruction to the foundation of this world. Apart from that most direct living being, he did not notice the changes of the other living beings. Even if he did notice it, he would only treat it as a mutation caused by ordinary living beings. He did not associate it with the tribulation. After knowing this, Luo Fan extended his perception outwards. This time, he did not look towards the thousands of worlds in the transportation network. Instead, he looked towards the tribulation layer above the transportation network. Through his research and exploration back then, he was able to correctly recognize the existence of the tribulation layer. In this simulated chaotic state, once he correctly recognized it, he would be able to see its existence. Because of this, he could see that the tribulation layer was above the transportation network. It existed there in an overbearing manner. In fact, Luo Fan even suspected that the tribulation layer might exist in such a manner above all chaotic layers that he could understand. Chapter 27:13. The world will naturally digest the baleful aura, and time will naturally smooth out the entanglements of karma. In this case, the tribulations caused by living beings will never erupt again. Luo Fan sensed all of this, and all kinds of enlightenment surged in his heart. At this moment, he already understood why the world was said to be without tribulations and immeasurable. If even he could do it, the world would definitely be able to do it. Moreover, the world would definitely be able to do it more perfectly and absolutely than what he could do now. Of course, although he was unwilling to admit it, Luo Fan was also very clear that the various manifestations of the tribulations that he had encountered were only a small part of the possible manifestations. At a level that he had never understood or even thought of, there were still various manifestations of the tribulations. This was absolutely unavoidable as long as he had not become a true sage. In fact, even if he became a true sage, he might not be able to completely avoid it. Just as Luo Fan was secretly thinking about all these, the heavenly Tao that had become the ruler of the entire world suddenly trembled slightly. The heavenly Tao poured into the entire world, and the power in the depths of the bodies and minds of almost all living beings also fluctuated subtly. In this fluctuation, it was unknown how many tribulations bypassed the obstruction of the heavenly Tao's power and broke into the depths of the bodies and minds of those living beings. When Luo Fan sensed this scene, he suddenly smiled. Fortunately, I used antivirus software and firewall to fuse to form the heavenly Tao just in case. Just as he was thinking about this, the originally invisible and intangible heavenly Tao that permeated the entire world suddenly took shape, forming the shape of a long river in the void. This long river had no beginning and no end, as if it was only limited to space, but also as if it was directly connected to the past, present, and future. It was extremely mysterious and wonderful. At this moment, the long river trembled endlessly, and there were endless waves constantly surging within it. Two different but equally mysterious and wonderful colors that could not be described with words began to continuously appear in the long river. They constantly collided and crushed each other, as if they were engaged in some kind of indescribable battle. Following this change, the entire river gradually disappeared once more. As it disappeared, the power of the heavenly Tao that had poured into the depths of the bodies and minds of all living beings to fight against the power of the tribulations completely stabilized. The suppression effect on the power of the tribulations also recovered, making it difficult for the power of the tribulations to fuse into the depths of the bodies and minds of living beings. Everything that had happened earlier was actually very simple. The will within the heavenly Tao had also been affected by the power of the tribulation, and the power of the tribulation had infiltrated the depths of its body. One must know that the will of the heavenly Tao was also a kind of will that could destroy living beings. Seriously speaking, it was also a type of living being. Since they were living creatures, they would naturally encounter the disasters of living creatures. At that moment, the power of the tribulation would naturally have the opportunity to invade the depths of his will and change it, and then change the heaven Tao and the various methods of the heaven Tao. If there was only one will of the heavenly way, then as long as Luo Fan didn't want to see the tribulation erupt again, he could only personally erase the power in the depths of the will of the heavenly way. This was the only way. However, it was clear that the preparations that Luo Fan had made for the heavenly way had eliminated this danger. This was because the will of the heavenly way was formed from the fusion of the antivirus software and the firewall. It had two cores, so it could be considered as two wills. Therefore, when one of the wills was affected by the power of the tribulation, the other reacted immediately and used the power of the heavenly Tao to enter the depths of the wills, resisting the power of the tribulation that the wills encountered. This situation was not affected by the number of wills that had been invaded by the power of the tribulation. After all, it was difficult for living beings to sense the power of the tribulation affecting them, but they could sense that other living beings and wills were affected by the power of the tribulation. It was just like how a person could see other people, but it was absolutely difficult for them to see their own faces. Under such circumstances, regardless of whether the will of the heavenly way was affected by the power of the tribulation or not, it could still help the other will resist the power of the tribulation. As a result, the power of the tribulation could not truly change the will of the heavenly way. As the heavenly way stabilized, the power of the tribulation that targeted living beings could no longer take advantage of it. The signs of the tribulation that were gradually appearing in the world gradually disappeared. The disappearance of the signs allowed the cultivators in the world to finally relax. Ever since Dang Chong found out about the existence of the tribulation from Luo Fan, all living beings in the world felt endless fear towards the tribulation. They were worried that the tribulation would descend at any time, destroy the world, and cause all living beings to die. It was precisely because of this that the fake saint paid so much attention to the reactions of all living beings. It was also why he immediately discovered the signs of the tribulation and came to ask for Luo Fan's opinion. Now, after he came to ask for Luo Fan's opinion, the signs of the tribulation were soon completely erased, and the entire world was freed from the shadow of the tribulation. To them, this situation had basically increased Luo Fan's credibility by a few levels. For a time, the respect that all living beings had for the Path Master grew stronger. There were actually signs that faith was about to be formed. Luo Fan did not pay much attention to what all living beings thought about him. At this moment, he only focused his attention on the signs of the new tribulation that might appear in the world. He did not believe that the tribulation would give up just because he had extinguished the trigger of the tribulation this time. As long as his world of laws was in the simulated state of chaos and was covered by the tribulation, then the tribulation would not pass easily. At the very least, it would not pass easily before he passed the 9 great tribulations that were stipulated in the simulated state of chaos. Now that the trigger of the tribulation had been extinguished, what the tribulation would do was definitely not retreat. Instead, it would look for other ways and think of other ways. Therefore, as long as Luo Fan didn't want to watch helplessly as his world was destroyed by the tribulation, the only thing he could do was to pay attention to the changes in this world and nip the tribulation that this world might suffer in the bud. The reason why he did not directly push everything to the heavenly Tao like before and instead wanted to be vigilant was actually quite simple. It was because the trigger of the previous tribulation had already told him that even if he had ascended to become the heavenly Tao, the antivirus software and firewall would not be safe. They still had the possibility of being controlled by the tribulation. If he really threw everything to the heavenly Tao, who knew when he would come back to his senses, the world might have already been completely destroyed. This kind of defense was obviously a rather troublesome way to deal with it. However, Luo Fan was vaguely enjoying it. The way to pass such a great tribulation was to comprehend some of the principles and mysteries that he needed so that he could improve and meet the requirements of the tribulation. Therefore, it would not be too beneficial for him to directly pass the tribulation. Instead, fighting with the tribulation was the most beneficial way for him to deal with it. At this moment, he was waiting to fight with the tribulation, using the world of laws as a battlefield to fight. Time slowly passed. Unknowingly, 100,000 years had passed in the world of laws. Due to the cultivation system that Luo Fan had spread in the past 100,000 years, the growth of the cultivators in the world of laws was hundreds or thousands of times faster than before. In just 100,000 years, the number of false saints in the world of laws had already been counted in the tens of thousands. As for the cultivators below the quasi-saint realm and above, there were so many of them that their value could not even be listed. Among them, the false saint who had once reported the omen of the tribulation to Luo Fan had already raised his realm to the 4th rank false saint realm. He was more than 10,000 times stronger than before. However, even after reaching this realm, he was still insignificant compared to Luo Fan. In fact, the more powerful he was, the more he could sense how unfathomable Luo Fan was, and the more he respected and trusted Luo Fan. On this day, Luo Fan frowned in the Tao Palace. However, he suddenly discovered that a subtle change had appeared in this part of the world. Some existences that should have been annihilated in the passage of time were suddenly born in this world of laws. Although there were only a few of them now, the trend of change was constantly increasing. In other words, if Luo Fan did not pay attention to them, they would increase with the passage of time, and in the end, they might even cause an unimaginable impact on the entire world of laws. Why would they reappear? Is it a coincidence, or is it inevitable? Luo Fan frowned. There were all kinds of existences that had been annihilated in the passage of time. There were living things, dead things, and among living things there were animals, plants, and even microorganisms. There were countless of them. The reason why they completely disappeared in the development of the world of laws was not by chance, nor was it because Luo Fan or any other existence that had a great influence on the world of laws wanted to see them annihilated. Their disappearance was inevitable in the development of the world of laws. It was like a certain kind of microorganism that could only survive in an environment that was filled with chaotic vitality. Such an environment could only exist for a short period of time when the world of laws had just been created. Once time passed, the world of laws had stabilized, and all the chaotic vitality had completely turned into connate vitality. Those microorganisms would naturally be annihilated due to the loss of their living environment. This was naturally the most extreme behavior. Apart from that, all kinds of animals, plants, and even living things in between animals and plants had disappeared due to similar reasons. Such a way of disappearance meant that once these existences disappeared, they would never be able to appear in the world of laws again. After all, the environmental changes of the world of laws were generally irreversible. Just like the chaotic vitality, once they disappeared, they would disappear forever to the world of laws. It was impossible for the world of laws to naturally evolve into an environment that contained the chaotic vitality. But now, these existences that had disappeared and been annihilated in the passage of time began to appear in the world of laws one after another. They did not appear alone, but accompanied by some kind of environment that matched their appearance. They appeared in the world of laws together. This situation was abnormal and unnatural no matter how one looked at it. Could this be another manifestation of the predestined fate? Luo Fan frowned slightly as he thought to himself. It had been 100,000 years since the last omen of the predestined fate. These 100,000 years were a period of great development for many cultivators in the world of laws. However, to Luo Fan, it was an extremely boring 100,000 years. During these 100,000 years, he could only stay in the world of laws and use his powerful will to sense all the abnormalities in the world of laws and search for any omens that might appear. Because of this boredom, he had previously discovered some abnormalities several times. He thought that they were the omens of the predestined fate, or the trigger of the predestined fate. But every time, he discovered that these abnormalities were only the result of various coincidences and coincidences. They could be considered some kind of natural change in the world of laws. Now, such a change, could it be another kind of accident or coincidence? With such doubts in his heart, Luo Fan did not take action immediately. Instead, he just locked his will on these changes and observed the development of these changes. He intended to see if these changes had anything to do with the predestined fate. After observing for a few years, Luo Fan was sure that this was definitely the effect of the predestined fate. There was no other reason. It was because not only did various existences that had been annihilated in the passage of time appear in this world of laws, but there were also existences that had yet to appear in this world of laws. In fact, they might not even appear in this world of laws. If it was said that the appearance of existences that had been annihilated in the passage of time might be due to various coincidences, then the appearance of existences that had yet to appear in the future and those that had been annihilated in the past was obviously not something that could be explained by coincidence. Only an extremely powerful existence could have supported their appearance from behind. Only then could such an outcome be possible. And obviously, for the current world of laws, the only thing that could support their appearance was the power of the predestined fate that even Luo Fan could not control. Chapter 27:14. The changes that appeared out of thin air were obviously not the result of the natural evolution of the world. Since it was not the result of the natural evolution of the world, there was naturally some kind of external existence that was affecting this world. Clearly, the most likely external existence at the moment was the power of the tribulation. As for what kind of power it was, how it worked, and what methods should be used to resist and cut off its source, he would have to search and research carefully to find out. The past, the present, and the future. It seems like it's against the power of time. After being excited by the reappearance of the tribulations, Luo Fan focused his attention on the possible means by which the power of the tribulations could reach this level of change. The past, present, and future divided the entire river of time. Now, all kinds of things that had been annihilated in the past and had yet to be born in the future appeared out of thin air at this point in time. No matter how he looked at it, this could only happen if there were some abnormalities in the river of time. Now that he had a guess in his heart, it was very obvious what he should do. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and the perspective of his eyes instantly changed. The world of laws at this point in time began to sink gradually, and countless worlds began to lay out and arrange themselves in his eyes. Eventually, they overlapped and turned into an unimaginably huge river formed by countless worlds. This long river was the river of time. The countless worlds were the worlds of laws at different times. At this moment, the number of worlds that existed on this long river was endless, even beyond the limits of what could be described with numbers. This also meant that the number of points in time covered by this long river was also beyond the limits of what could be described with numbers. Of course, it was said that countless worlds overlapped to form the long river, but in fact, it was naturally impossible for the worlds to be arranged in the way that ordinary living beings understood. Instead, it was arranged in an extremely incredible and peculiar way that exceeded the scope of understanding of living beings. It felt as if he was looking at it from a higher dimensional perspective. Such a peculiar arrangement made the world of laws at every point in time above the long river of time a complete world. All the details of the world of laws at that point in time could be found in the world at that point in time. If it were outside the world of laws, it would naturally not be that easy for Luo Fan to achieve this. At the very least, he needed to make a lot of preparations, and he also needed the owner of the world to not place any restrictions on him. However, in this world of laws, he could easily accomplish this with a single thought. In fact, if he wanted to, he could even jump back to the past through the river of time and go to the future with ease. Of course, if he were to return to the past, then for the transportation network layer, what the transportation network layer reflected at this time would be the world of the time he had jumped back to in the past. After all, the flow of time in this world was independent from the outside world. The changes in time here were naturally limited to the world of laws. Naturally, the outside world would not be affected by this. Similarly, if Luo Fan jumped directly to the future, it would also affect this world. However, from the perspective of the transportation network layer, it would seem that this world had jumped directly to the future. Because of this, jumping to the past and to the outside world was actually meaningless to Luo Fan. It would not allow him to change the past of the outside world and achieve the result of taking medicine for regret. It was also because of this that even though Luo Fan had the ability to do so, he had never tried to do so. However, the situation this time was naturally different from before. At this moment, what Luo Fan wanted to find was the power of the tribulation that had obviously involved the river of time. At that moment, he did not hesitate, and immediately began to thoroughly investigate the entire river of time. From the moment the world of laws was born, which was also the moment the time of the world of laws appeared, which was also the beginning of the entire river of time, he thoroughly investigated the end of the river of time bit by bit in search of the power of the tribulation that was almost certain to exist. The past was unique, but the future was infinite. From the perspective of the river of time, from this point in time, there was only one huge main branch of the river of time, extending from the moment when time was first born to this point in time. From this point in time to the boundlessly distant future, the river of time gave birth to countless tributaries. And these countless tributaries also gave birth to endless tributaries. This made the river of time look like a big tree with only a main branch. The future point in time after the present was like the roots of the big tree buried in the ground, and the time before the present point in time was like the main branch of the big tree on the ground. Of course, time passed bit by bit, and the present point in time was also constantly moving towards the future. And this kind of movement, every bit of movement was equivalent to gathering a bit more of the infinite future. It felt like there was a huge hand grabbing the river of time and pulling it back bit by bit as time passed, grabbing the roots that had originally been separated into countless parts bit by bit and fusing them with the main branch, turning them into the only past. The entire process was endless, and it formed an indescribably mysterious scene. After thoroughly investigating the past, Luo Fan thought to himself, "It's very uniform." In the past, he hadn't sensed any obvious signs of tribulation. All he had sensed was a faint, indistinct aura that he wouldn't have been able to sense if he hadn't had a strong first impression of it. Moreover, this aura was scattered to every point in time in the entire river of time. In other words, in the world of laws at every point in time in the past, the aura of this tribulation filled the entire past, and when it was scattered to a single point in time, it became insignificant. Not to mention really having any effect, it would probably be quite difficult to even maintain it. But according to this aura of the tribulation, it was obviously not enough to mobilize some existences in the past to this point in time. Thinking of this, he faintly understood in his heart. Then, he turned his gaze to the future in the river of time. It was an infinite future that could not even be described with numbers. From this point in time, every additional tributary that extended represented a future direction of the world of laws. Countless tributaries represented the existence of countless directions. Even though Luo Fan was the creator of the world of laws and the absolute controller of the entire world of laws, he could not perfectly thoroughly investigate the countless possibilities of the countless futures. Therefore, at this time, he could only roughly sense the future with the faint aura of the tribulation among the countless futures. As he sensed it, he instantly eliminated most of the futures. These futures did not have the aura of the tribulation. At the very least, it meant that these futures were very likely to not be affected by the power of the tribulation. At the very least, they were not within the scope of the power of the tribulation this time. Obviously, for Luo Fan, who was working hard to deal with the tribulation this time, these futures could obviously be put aside for now. Among the remaining half of the futures, it did not make much difference which one Luo Fan chose. At the very least, there was no difference to him, who did not understand anything. Therefore, at this moment, he randomly chose a future that was affected by the aura of the tribulation. Through this future, he continuously searched towards the end. He had already talked about the difference between the past and the future. Although Luo Fan chose a future from the countless futures, this future could also give rise to countless futures. If he wanted to continue searching towards the future, he would need to choose another future from the countless futures. Just like this, the future would give rise to the future, until there was no end. Fortunately, Luo Fan was the creator of this world, the existence that controlled everything in this world. Such an endless situation wasn't an obstacle that he couldn't get around. In every choice, he only chose a future that was enveloped by the aura of the tribulation. Moreover, he usually chose a future that was covered by the aura of the tribulation. Just like this, he had unknowingly explored 300,000 years in the future. When he explored 300,000 years in the future, everything in front of him made him suddenly understand what was going on. 300,000 years in the future that he chose to explore, the entire world of laws had turned into ruins. All the laws, heavenly laws, great Daos, and even Luo Fan himself had been completely shattered in that future. The endless power of the tribulation filled the world of laws in the future, constantly sweeping through everything in the world of laws and destroying everything that could be destroyed. Vaguely, the entire world seemed to be gradually collapsing and being destroyed. The collapse and destruction were clearly in the end of this future, which was also the end of the river of time. It's guiding the development of the timeline and forcing it to move closer to the final end. The aura of the tribulation that filled the entire river of time was clearly emitted from the final end. The presence of the tribulations was profound, and it was being manipulated by the tribulations to spread across the entire river of time, constructing an invisible path. Or rather, it was creating an invisible binding effect, causing the countless futures to converge towards a single future as they developed. Once the countless futures converged into a single future, the victory of the tribulations was almost guaranteed. Thinking of this, Luo Fan also knew that the countless other futures that were filled with the aura of the tribulation were actually all similar futures. They were all futures where the world of laws was completely destroyed in the tribulation. In this way, there were countless possibilities for the binding of the future. Countless possibilities of walking towards destruction that the tribulation was extremely satisfied with. The existences from the past that had been drowned and the existences from the future that had yet to be born were obviously the results of this binding. Or rather, the river of time naturally moved the past and the future to the present in order to satisfy this binding. Obviously, a certain environment was required in order to collect the countless futures in a targeted manner. The timeline wasn't a car after all. It couldn't be turned with just a turn of the steering wheel. If one wanted to twist the timeline and make it move in a certain direction, one would obviously need to manage all kinds of possibilities. And if one wanted to manage all kinds of possibilities, one would naturally need to create all kinds of environments. If the world was allowed to develop naturally and had countless choices and possibilities, then it would naturally be good to let the world continue moving in the normal environment. There was no need to take any action at all. However, if one wanted the world to walk towards a future that was unlikely to happen under normal development, then one would obviously need to change the current environment and cause certain factors of the world to deviate. And obviously, with Luo Fan's existence, the possibility of the world of laws heading towards destruction and being completely destroyed by the tribulation was relatively small. In other words, according to the normal environment of the world of laws, it was almost impossible to reach that outcome. Therefore, in order to satisfy this possibility, in order to satisfy the direction that the power of the tribulation guided the timeline in, it would naturally need to greatly modify the various factors of the world. This modification was the result of the natural effect of the river of time. It wasn't the power of the tribulation itself that was mobilized, nor was it created by some existence in the tribulation. It could be said that for the power of the tribulation, it only stipulated an outcome. The process in the middle completely allowed the river of time to take initiative. As a result, before the change occurred, the power of the tribulation probably didn't know that the change would be like this. It was also because of this that the change was so huge, and it was also why the change appeared in front of Luo Fan without any concealment. Moreover, this was also the reason why Luo Fan couldn't find the direct reason for the change at all. After understanding this, Luo Fan completely understood what he had to do. Immediately, his heart moved slightly, and the river of time surged endlessly. Chapter 27:15. The future that Luo Fan chose at this time was naturally the future that didn't have the aura of tribulations. It wasn't difficult to choose such a future. Even if so many futures were covered by the aura of tribulations, it was impossible for the aura of tribulations to completely cover all the futures. The part of the future that was covered was ultimately only a part. It was really easy to find a future that wasn't covered by the aura of tribulations among the countless futures. And choosing a certain future wouldn't affect the future development of this world. Infinity within infinity was also infinity. Any point in time had an infinite future, and a certain future among these infinite futures also had its own infinite future. Just like that, even if Luo Fan chose one of the infinite futures to be the future of this world, it wouldn't cause the future to have no other possibilities just because of such a choice. It wouldn't cause the future to turn into a path with no future. Even if he stepped into this future, the future would still be infinite. All the possibilities of the future still existed. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan didn't have any psychological barriers when choosing this future. However, although it was simple to choose a certain future, it wasn't easy to completely turn the timeline towards this future and make all the futures converge towards this future. At this moment, Luo Fan felt an unimaginable resistance emanating from the river of time. This resistance was extremely ordinary at the beginning, just like the force he exerted. But as the force he exerted on it grew stronger, the resistance also grew stronger. In the end, the force even made Luo Fan's body and mind tremble violently. He faintly felt that his existence was about to be expelled from this world. The river of time itself was a part of this world, and it could be said to be a certain attribute of this world. At this moment, the astonishing resistance that erupted from the river of time seemed to have gathered all the power, and mysteries of this world. The final result was that even Luo Fan, the creator of this world, was faintly unable to bear it and was about to leave this world under the effect of this repulsive force. This situation made Luo Fan frown slightly. One must know that it was precisely because he knew the special characteristics of the river of time and understood that the river of time was a part of the world of laws. It was also because of this that he had the confidence to use such a direct method to reverse the flow of the river of time and prevent the river of time from being destroyed by the calamity. After all, he was the creator of this world. Everything in this world originated from him, and he could change everything with a single thought. However, he didn't expect that it would be so difficult to change the river of time. Even he, the creator of the river of time, found it difficult to control. He was unable to change the river of time according to his will. Luo Fan continued to exert more force, almost causing him to be expelled by the world of laws. He knew that it was impossible for such a direct method to succeed. If this were to continue, the greatest possibility would be that he, the creator of the world, would be directly rejected by the world. After understanding this, he could only stop moving. What should I do? This question surfaced in his heart. The flow of the river of time had to be changed. If it didn't change, then according to the method of renting the power of the calamity, the world of laws would eventually be destroyed. It would turn into ruins under the power of the calamity and be completely annihilated. Luo Fan absolutely rejected such an outcome. He had to find a way to avoid it no matter what. With this thought in mind, he observed the river of time aimlessly. He watched as the river of time continued to flow towards the future, watching as the countless futures gradually became the past at this point in time. Suddenly, he had a flash of inspiration and looked at the entire river of time. Why is the power of the tribulations able to change the future? Even I, the Creator, was repelled by the world when I tried to do this. How is the power of the tribulations able to surpass me, the Creator of the world? This question surfaced in his heart. As this question arose, the aura of the calamity that filled the entire river of time, be it the past, present, or future, was reflected in his eyes. After seeing this aura, he suddenly understood what he had to do. This method of using the power of the calamity was not like what he had done before, which was to directly reverse the flow of the river of time and directly twist the river of time to the future where the power of the calamity would completely destroy the world of laws. Instead, starting from the beginning of the river of time, it spread its power throughout the past, present, and future of the river of time, exerting influence on the river of time from every point in time. At every point in time, it would strive to obtain a little bit of results and gain a little bit of advantage. In the end, its influence and advantages would accumulate until at some point in time, it would truly reverse the river of time and turn the world of laws into a future that the calamity hoped to see. This method was just like if one wanted to nurture a living being into a certain kind of talent, one needed to exert influence on the living being from the moment it was born, from the moment it first learned. In the end, at a certain point in time, it would grow into that kind of talent. However, it would not directly distort its will at some point in time and make it directly choose to become that kind of talent. The river of time was obviously that kind of creature, and the future was a variety of talents. Wanting to make the river of time turn into a certain future was equivalent to cultivating the creature into a talent in a certain field. Luo Fan's previous method was like directly making the creature choose a certain field at the point of choosing a job, a field that the creature itself was extremely against. In that case, it would naturally be extremely difficult, and it would suffer a backlash from the creature. The method of the calamity was to exert influence on the creature from time to time from the moment it was born. For example, it would instill into the creature how good a certain field was, how promising a certain field was, how much a certain field could bring to it, and so on. Unknowingly, it would change the mindset of the creature. In this way, when it came time to choose a job, the creature would naturally involuntarily choose that field and complete the goal of the power of the calamity. It was self-evident which of the two methods was more ingenious. After seeing this clearly, Luo Fan naturally knew what he should do. Fortunately, this world of laws was created by him. His power could naturally connect to the past, present, and future of this world of laws. Therefore, it was not difficult for the power of the calamity to send its aura to the moment the world was born or to the end of the river of time. With a slight thought, his power had already spread to every inch of the entire river of time, covering countless points of time from the birth of this world of laws to the present, and then to a certain future. Boundless power continued to pour out, pouring into the river of time. At this moment, a subtle feeling of emptiness emerged from the bottom of his heart. Although this feeling of emptiness was quickly made up for by the endless power and power that was naturally born in his body, it returned to its perfect state. However, emptiness was emptiness. The emptiness caused by the exhaustion of the power and power in his body was something that Luo Fan had not felt for billions of years. Ever since he became a connate grand heavenly Luo and gained the ability to be self-sufficient, Luo Fan had almost never worried about the power and power in his body. All he cared about was the realm, the profoundness, and the various changes that he could not understand. However, now that he had reached the peak of the sixth tribulation realm and was not much weaker than ordinary seventh tribulation realm powerhouses, he once again felt the emptiness of the power and power in his body being exhausted in the face of the world of laws and the river of time that he had created. This situation made him feel a little shocked. Given his current state, if the power and power in his body were to really erupt, he could instantly crush a group of worlds, let alone a world. In terms of quantity alone, it could be said that even if thousands of worlds were to use all their means to extract the power and power in his body at the same time, he probably would not feel any emptiness because of it. From this, it could be said that the appearance of this emptiness represented something. Luo Fan was slightly surprised by this emptiness, but he put it aside. This was because he had already figured out the reason behind it. Although the river of time was called a long river, there was actually no water or sand in it. What it did have was a world of laws and a world of laws. The entire river of time was actually laid out in the order of the flow of time by the world of laws in the endless points of time. From the birth of the world and the appearance of time until now, the answer to how many points of time could time be divided into was infinite. Spreading from the present all the way to the past, covering every point of time in the past and present with his power. How many laws of heaven and earth were involved? The answer was naturally the number of points of time, which meant that it was infinite. No matter what it was, when the prefix infinite was added, it would become extremely terrifying. Even if Luo Fan only covered these points of time with his own power did not actually consume too much. However, just this stacking had caused him to exhaust an unimaginable amount of energy. In practically an instant, the energy and might within his body had been completely exhausted. It was so much so that even his unimaginable recovery speed could not keep up with it. It was because of this that he felt this emptiness. However, this feeling of emptiness only lasted for a moment. As Luo Fan realized the speed at which the river of time absorbed power, he began to adjust the speed at which the power in his body were produced. Very soon, he had already re-established the balance between power, allowing his body to quickly maintain an extremely perfect state. Fortunately, this world was created by me. At this moment, Luo Fan could not help but think. If this world wasn't created by him, he wouldn't have had the opportunity to consume power like this at all. In order to completely cover an infinite point of time and an infinite world of laws, one would need to have an equally infinite power. Obviously, an ordinary cultivator would not be able to take out such an infinite amount of power. Unless one was a true saint, who else could have infinite power? Only Luo Fan, as the creator of this world, had absolute control over this world, which allowed him to bypass this infinite limit and use his own power to exhaust the entire river of time, covering every point of time above the river of time with his power. However, as the creator of this world, there was a limit to his authority. He had already done his best to bypass the limit, and it was impossible for him to completely avoid the exhaustion of his power and energy. In order to cover every point of time with his power, Luo Fan spent dozens of days. At a certain moment after dozens of days, he felt his body tremble, and the entire river of time was completely imprinted in his perception. Every detail, every change that could be affected, and even any influence that the power of the tribulations had on it were completely imprinted in his heart. In a trance, his heart moved slightly, and an inexplicable expression appeared on his face. I see, as he thought of this, the power that covered every point of time began to undergo various subtle changes without him making any movements. Under these subtle changes, an indescribable distortion appeared in the river of time. Amidst the distortion, the power of the tribulations that originally covered the entire river of time was repelled in various unbelievable ways. Many points of time in the river of time began to tremble violently, and strands of power kept breaking away from the river of time, or rather, breaking away from the world of laws at those points of time. These powers were naturally affected by Luo Fan's power. Chapter 27:16. Wisps of tribulation power gradually broke away from the river of time. They stuck to each other and connected with each other, gradually turning into a strange mist that shrouded the river of time. It was as if a strange cloud had appeared there. Following this change, the forks that were filled with the aura of tribulations at the border between the present and the future began to decrease rapidly. Evidently, because the aura of the past tribulations had been expelled, the possibility of the world developing towards the end, where it would be completely destroyed by the tribulations, was greatly reduced. Seeing this, Luo Fan knew that his plan had achieved initial success. Using this method, it was indeed possible to avoid the calamity and completely change the future of this world. In fact, compared to what he had imagined before, the current situation seemed to be even more perfect. Previously, he had thought of using a similar method to forcefully twist the future to a future where there was no possibility of the tribulations destroying the world. But from the looks of it now, he did not need to go through so much trouble at all. He probably only needed to expel the aura of the past tribulations, and the future where the tribulations destroyed the world would completely disappear. He did not need to do anything else at all. Faced with such a situation, there was no need to say what choice Luo Fan would make. At this moment, he poured even more power into the river of time, flowing towards the world of laws at every point in time in the past. As more and more power was poured in, the power of the tribulations was expelled more and more. The forks that were filled with the aura of the past began to decrease. At this point in time, the various existences that had been destroyed in the past or had yet to appear in the future began to disappear rapidly. Moreover, after they disappeared, the memories that they left in the hearts of all living beings also began to disappear rapidly. In other words, the living beings that had seen these existences that should not have appeared in the world completely forgot that they had seen them after they disappeared. Even the consequences caused by the existence of these existences were completely reversed, as if nothing had happened. Only Luo Fan was able to see all these strange changes. All other living beings, including the fake saints, did not notice it at all. They were also one of the living beings, and they were also suffering from the erasure of memories. This process lasted for an unknown period of time. At some point in time, a strange tremor suddenly appeared above the river of time and light. In that instant, the entire river of time produced an indescribable repulsive force, directly acting on the tribulations that had been repelled but still shrouded the river of time. For a time, the might of the tribulation became extremely turbulent, and the river of time started to undergo subtle changes. It seemed to have become more complete, and it seemed to have become purer. Under the repulsive effect of the river of time, the various tribulations that enveloped the river of time rapidly collapsed and disintegrated. In the end, they vanished without a trace as if they had never appeared. Eliminated. At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. The omen of this tribulation had been eliminated by him once again. The omen of the tribulation this time was even more mysterious, strange, and untraceable than the ones that had erupted from the hearts of the living beings before. Previously, the omen of the tribulation that had appeared from the depths of the living beings' hearts could still work. However, the omen of the tribulation that had appeared above the river of time this time could not even be sensed by the heavenly Tao. Now that the omen of the tribulation had been eliminated, the heavenly Tao still did not sense it at all, as if nothing had happened at all. From this, Luo Fan could also see the limitations of the heavenly Tao. While Luo Fan was thinking of a way to completely eliminate the omen of the tribulation that had appeared above the river of time, the process of transcending the tribulation in the transportation network gradually came to an end. However, the results of their transcendence varied. Among the many worlds, only a small portion of the benefits of transcending the tribulation in the most perfect manner were able to truly transcend the tribulation. In terms of quantity, it was less than 1,000 cubic meters. Most of the remaining worlds had transcended the tribulation, but their own worlds were severely damaged. They needed to spend most of the benefits they had obtained after transcending the tribulation to repair their world. However, the last small portion could not even do that. In the end, they could not withstand the attack of the tribulation at all, and their worlds were destroyed. Of course, there were also a few encounters for the creators of these worlds that could not withstand the tribulation and were completely destroyed. Some of them had quick reflexes and managed to escape before the world was about to be destroyed. Although the creators of this world had lost their own world, they did not suffer too much damage. Not only did they have the chance to start again, but they would also comprehend many things in the process due to the impact of the tribulation, making their foundations more solid. If they started again, their starting point would be much better than before. As for the remaining creators of these worlds, most of them did not react in time and were more or less damaged when their worlds were destroyed. Such pioneers of the world still had the chance to start over, but at least for the time being, or in other words, for a long time to come, they would not be able to seize this chance. That was because they needed a long period of time to recover their bodies and minds and recover from their injuries. In the end, the small portion of the remaining creators of these worlds were those that had fused too deeply with the world or reacted too slowly. In the end, they did not manage to escape after their worlds were destroyed. However, they had died along with the destruction of the world, and their souls had dispersed. There were more than 100 world founders who died and their souls dispersed. As for those that had been destroyed, there were close to 1,000 of them. 1/10 of the creators had perished along with the world. Although this proportion was high, it was still a considerable amount. When Luo Fan eliminated the omen of the tribulation and turned his gaze to the many worlds in the transportation network layer, he could not help but sigh inwardly when he saw the losses. It must be known that the creators were all geniuses. If they became his strength, it would be enough for him to use many more means to deal with the tribulation layer. Now that he had lost over 100 of them, the loss was a little too great. However, those thoughts only flashed through his mind. Although there were quite a few losses, these losses were nothing compared to the rewards they had reaped. Compared to Luo Fan, who felt that it was a pity, the other creators did not feel that much. At this time, they were all excited about their own good fortune. Those who had passed the tribulation perfectly were using their peak state to absorb the various benefits given by the tribulation layer. They were trying their best to feel the wonderful feeling of the world and themselves metamorphosing at the same time, so how could they have the mood to pay attention to the situation of the other worlds? On the other hand, the creators who had not passed the tribulation perfectly were trying their best to control all the benefits given by the tribulation layer. They were trying their best to use those benefits to repair and refine the world. They even wanted to magnify a single benefit 10 times, so that they could leave more benefits for their worlds so that they could undergo greater metamorphosis. It was even more impossible for them to pay attention to the situation of the other world. As for the creators who had not passed the tribulation and were destroyed, they did notice the many creators that had been destroyed along with the world. However, so what if they noticed it? At this moment, they would only be glad that they had escaped quickly and that they had made a prompt decision. They would not feel emotional about the destruction of the creators. After all, before the transportation network layer was completely established, the many creators did not have much contact with each other. In terms of friendship, it was impossible for them to have much. Without much friendship, they would naturally only see their own reflections of the past from the other creators. How could they feel emotional about it so easily? That was why, in the end, after the world founders were destroyed, not a single one of the world founders in the transportation network felt any sorrow for their death. All they felt was indifference. At this moment, the tribulation layer above the transportation network layer became more and more blurry. Only a faint, indistinct shadow was left in the clan. As for the countless tribulation channels that extended down from the tribulation layer like lines of rain that led to the depths of the hearts and minds of the many living beings in the world, they gradually disappeared. Of course, they only disappeared. Luo Fan could clearly sense that they still existed and were still connected to the hearts and minds of the many living beings in the various worlds in the same way. However, at this moment, the passageways had yet to be truly activated. There was still no power pouring into the world through the passageways, or rather, into the hearts and minds of the many living beings in the world. That was why all of this was hidden. However, even if it had disappeared, Luo Fan could still sense a vague and indistinct shadow in the tribulation layer. This was the true existence of the tribulation layer, but it would not disappear just because the power of the tribulation layer did not take effect. When Luo Fan learned about the existence of the tribulation layer, learned how it worked, and understood that the essence of the tribulation layer was above the transportation network layer, the existence of the tribulation layer could no longer escape his senses. Even though the tribulation layer no longer had any effect on the transportation network layer and seemed to no longer have any power pouring into any of the worlds, he could still sense its existence. Looks like it's going to stop for a while. Luo Fan came to a realization when he saw this scene. Simulating the state of chaos was extremely mysterious and wonderful, even though it was only a simulation of the state of chaos. However, compared to an existence like Luofan, this kind of simulation already gave it the characteristics of the true state of chaos. Just like this moment, he clearly knew that there were millions of worlds in this simulated state of chaos, but he could not sense their existence no matter how he tried. Even if those heavens and earth were already under his control, it was still the same. All sorts of thoughts flashed through his mind. Suddenly, bits of inspiration appeared in his mind. Perhaps this isn't absolute against the tribulation layer. If I can sense it, could it be that these worlds are more profound than the tribulation layer? As he thought of this, an indescribable light flashed through his eyes. The tribulation level was an existence that was above the transportation network level. It could even pour all sorts of unimaginable power into all the worlds in the transportation network layer. No matter how he looked at it, such an existence was more profound than any of the worlds in the transportation network layer. If he could even sense the tribulation layer through the transportation network layer, could he really not have any way to sense those worlds? This situation was impossible no matter how he looked at it, right? As he thought of this, a faint understanding appeared on his face. I was prejudiced by my first impression. At this time, he already understood that the fundamental reason why he could not sense the existence of those worlds was because he was prejudiced by his first impression and believed that he could not sense them. He believed that those worlds were separated from the transportation network layer, which was equivalent to being separated from his range of perception. If he had not believed in this, he would have been able to sense the existence of those worlds a long time ago. It was just like when his world of laws had just been born. At that time, there was no transportation network layer. In fact, there wasn't even any connection with other worlds. Even so, he could see the countless worlds turn into a sky full of stars. The current situation was a little more complicated than before, and the changes in those worlds also made it very different from before. However, in essence, were these worlds really different from before to the extent that he could not sense them at all? After thinking about this, Luofan was already very clear about what he should do. Chapter 27:17. As he moved, the boundless darkness in his eyes began to undergo various subtle changes. There seemed to be all kinds of blurry and indistinct shadows appearing in the darkness. Vaguely, there seemed to be balls of strange light appearing and disappearing one after another. These balls of light were faintly discernible, and within those balls of light, there were countless tiny spots of light. At first glance, it seemed to be similar to the simulated state of chaos that he had sensed with the help of the world of laws when he first constructed the world of laws. However, the truth was that there was a fundamental difference between this scene and the one before. It wasn't because the countless balls of light and spots of light were blurry and indistinct. They weren't clear at all. It was also because at this moment, the countless balls of light and spots of light that appeared in his perception were simply multicolored and extremely gorgeous. Countless multicolored light dots adorned the endless pitch-black sky, causing the pitch-black sky to no longer have the desolation and deathly stillness from before. Instead, there was an additional indescribable liveliness. Is this the true simulated state of chaos? Looking at this scene, such a thought flashed across Luofan's mind. He felt as if his worldview was about to be overturned. However, he quickly denied his own thoughts. No, this might not be the true truth of the simulated state of chaos. Perhaps this is only a small part of the true state of chaos. What I'm seeing now might be the same as what I saw back then. It might not be complete. With this thought in mind, the expression on his face became calm again. It was enough to make a mistake once, but to make the same mistake repeatedly was something that would never happen to him. Even with his current strength, his understanding of the simulated state of chaos was much stronger than before. However, He wasn't absolutely confident that the simulated state of chaos that he understood at this time was the truth of the simulated state of chaos. The principles contained in it were also the principles contained in all simulated states of chaos. With this understanding, he naturally understood that the simulation of the primal chaos state only had an extremely small probability of being the truth of the entire simulated primal chaos state. Everything that existed in the simulated state of chaos was already everything that existed in the simulated state of chaos. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind, and his mind became even more solemn. At that moment, he carefully distinguished them. Very soon, some light spots became clear in his senses. They were two balls of light. Two balls of light that seemed to be quite close to each other. The two balls of light gave off an inexplicable sense of familiarity. This inexplicable sense of familiarity told him that the two balls of light were none other than the two worlds formed by the convergence of many worlds that had transcended from the transportation network layer. The reason why it was a ball of light and not just a speck of light like the other worlds were. The reason was actually quite simple. Although those heavens and earths had already fused the heavens and earths they had created into a whole, forming a world of their own. However, this kind of fusion was obviously quite preliminary. In essence, those worlds were still those worlds, and they were still incompatible with each other. This kind of incompatibility couldn't be more obvious in the eyes of a truly brilliant existence. Obviously, Luo Fan was a truly brilliant existence. This kind of incompatibility was extremely clear in his eyes, and he didn't try to hide it at all. In this way, in his eyes, or rather, in his senses, those light spots didn't gather into a whole, and that was why they directly split into so many light spots and gathered into a ball of light. It became a river system in this boundless, pitch-black void. Of course, or rather, it was another river system in this incomparably bustling void. And the fates of these two balls of light were also different. At this moment, one of the balls of light was already becoming more and more stable. The connection between the many light spots within the ball of light was constantly deepening, and the light spots were fusing with each other bit by bit. On the other hand, the other ball of light was completely the opposite. The ball of light was constantly shaking, and occasionally, some light spots would completely extinguish and disappear without a trace. This kind of disappearance wasn't after the fusion, but the kind of disappearance that was completely extinguished. After the fusion disappeared, although the light spots would disappear, the other light spots would become brighter and more dazzling because of their disappearance. The overall brightness wouldn't change much because of this. However, now that the light spots in the ball of light had disappeared, it was different. The disappearance of the light spots caused the ball of light's brightness to continuously weaken. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan instantly understood what these two balls of light represented. The stable ones were obviously the simulated chaotic layer formed by the first batch of heavens and realms that had escaped. Or rather, the part of the world formed by them. And the remaining light spots that were continuously extinguishing were obviously the realms formed by the second batch of heavens and realms that had escaped. The first batch of heavens and realms had obviously reacted the fastest. In the process of escaping, they had completely severed the connection between them and the tribulation layer. They had severed the tribulation power's corrosion on them, at least for the time being. But the second batch of heavens and realms were different. Their reaction speed was too slow. When they escaped, not only did they fail to escape the tribulation power's corrosion, but they also brought the tribulation's incarnation into it and left the transportation network layer with it. Not only did they fail to escape, but they also brought the disaster with them, allowing the transportation network layer to gain a huge advantage. Therefore, it was natural to match the two with the ball of light. The stable ball of light was clearly the state where it had completely stabilized and was no longer affected by the tribulation. As for the ball of light that was growing dimmer and dimmer, it was clear that it was the manifestation of the tribulation destroying that part of the world, destroying every part and region of that world. As Luo Fan realized this, he instantly discovered that a certain area of the almost transparent tribulation layer had suddenly become no longer transparent. It had turned back into the appearance of the tribulation layer that he had seen at the beginning. And that area was none other than the simulated chaos layer, formed by the second batch of heavens and realms that had left the transportation network layer. In other words, it was the location of that part of the world that was formed. At this moment, the originally transparent tribulation layer above that area became solid. Countless channels extended from it and connected to the ball of light. The power of the tribulation continued to pour into the ball of light and into all the specks of light within the ball of light. Moreover, Luo Fan could even see that the power of the tribulation was undergoing all sorts of unimaginable changes in the constantly extinguishing specks of light. The power of the tribulation poured into the other specks of light and accelerated the extinguishing speed of those specks of light. Just like that, the cycle went on, over and over again. If it weren't for the large number of specks of light in the ball of light, even if the specks of light were extinguished so quickly, there would still be a considerable number of specks of light forming the ball of light. Otherwise, the ball of light would have been completely extinguished. Faced with this situation, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. Naturally, it wasn't something to be excited about seeing the complete destruction of the world. However, now that he had confirmed his guess and discovered a way to see through the entire simulated state of chaos, it was something to be happy about. At this moment, through the changes in the ball of light in front of him, Luo Fan had already found a way to truly see through the entire simulated chaos state and identify the truth of the entire simulated chaos state. The solution was none other than to start from this level of tribulation. In the true state of chaos, no world could be free of tribulation and immeasurable except for the big world. Obviously, there couldn't be a real big world in the simulated chaos state. After all, it was only a simulation of the state of chaos, and it was Luo Fan's seventh major tribulation. Such an existence naturally couldn't surpass the true divine level. The existence of the big world was obviously a transformation that surpassed the true divine level. Luo Fan was extremely certain about this. Since there couldn't be a big world in the simulated chaos state, naturally, there couldn't be a world that surpassed the tribulation layer. In other words, in the simulated chaos state, no matter how incredible, mysterious, and wonderful the world was, it would eventually be affected by the tribulation layer and would definitely be under the monitoring of the tribulation layer. In other words, regardless of the nature of the world, regardless of whether it was strong or weak, it would inevitably be related to the tribulation layer. In this way, he only needed to pass through this tribulation level, and he would naturally be able to sense everything that existed in this simulated chaotic state. If he wanted to, he could even forcibly pull them into the transportation network layer through a similar method as before. It was naturally impossible to achieve the final goal now. However, for the previous goal, Luo Fan already had a lot of ideas. If I want to clearly see all the worlds that are related to the tribulation layer, I must first identify the way they are related to the tribulation layer. Luo Fan thought to himself, and began to try to implement his idea just now. The connection between the tribulation layer and the world was very obvious, so it could only be the tribulation. And if the tribulation wanted to pour into the world, according to his previous experiences, it obviously had to build a passage that could simulate the state of chaos. Only when the passage was built could the power of the tribulation be sent into the world, and only then could the world truly fall into the tribulation. With a slight thought, the various details that he saw when the billions of worlds in the transportation network layer established a connection with the tribulation layer appeared in his mind. Billions of worlds established a connection with the tribulation layer, or rather, the tribulation layer established a connection with billions of worlds, so there must be incomparably many types of passages. It didn't dare to say that there were all types of passages, but it definitely included most of the types of worlds. Back then, Luo Fan used his identity as the controller of the transportation network to remember all the types of passages in his mind, and even had a relatively deep analysis of these passages. The reason why he could recognize the tribulation layer, and could still see the blurry image of the tribulation layer at this time, was one of the benefits of this deep analysis. Being able to extract such knowledge from the structure of the various passages was enough to prove how deep his understanding of the existence of the passages was. With such a deep understanding, he only needed to slightly recall at this time, and the structure of the countless possible passages had already resurfaced in the depths of his memory. In this endless world, there must be something that is currently experiencing a tribulation at this time. With this thought in mind, his eyes narrowed slightly, and his perception began to endlessly spread out through the world of laws. He constantly sensed the endless balls of light that filled the sky and the various strange worlds. Very soon, the countless balls of light and the countless worlds in his eyes began to undergo various subtle changes. The first to change was the tribulation layer. Originally, only the tribulation layer above the ball of light had solidified, and the tribulation layer that was no longer transparent had become extremely mottled. Countless opaque spots appeared out of thin air in the tribulation layer, or rather, they appeared above the endless balls of light. At a glance, it looked like there were strange shadows in the colorful balls of light and spots of light that filled the sky. After that, from those shadows, passageways that were rather familiar to Luo Fan extended out and directly inserted into the light spots. Looking at the way the light spots were constantly fluctuating, there seemed to be some strange existence that was constantly pouring into the light spots through these passageways. Many of the light spots were undergoing various subtle changes during this process. Some suddenly became stronger, some suddenly weakened, some suddenly changed color, and some suddenly extinguished. Among the endless balls of light and spots of light that filled the sky, the light spots that were not penetrated by the passageways that extended from the tribulation layer were still blurry and semi-transparent. However, the light spots and balls of light that had been penetrated by the passageways of the tribulation layer had become extremely clear. This clarity caused the light they emitted to look increasingly bright.